Anytime there's a hero.
You take it and you stick it under, and they put another one on top.
Taking up all the. The Judiciary Committee will please come to order, a quorum being present. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2 and House Rule 11, Clause 2, the Chair may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote for the ayes and nays are ordered. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3239, the Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in Customs and Border Protection Custody Act, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 3239, to require U.S. Customs and Border Protection to perform an initial health screening on detainees and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 3239, the Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in Customs and Border Protection Custody Act, responds to the chaos and cruelty of the Trump administration's immigration policy, a policy that has contributed to the needless deaths of 10 people in Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, custody in the last 9 months, including 3 children and 7 adults. This critical legislation would require all individuals in CBP custody to receive an initial medical screening and would set certain minimum standards of hygiene, nutrition, and shelter that CBP must meet. Treating individuals in CBP custody with basic standards of human decency is the very least that we can do, and it is outrageous that the administration may need Congress to act before it will do the right thing. For some time, we have been confronted with the images of too many children and families squeezed into overcrowded and unsanitary CBP facilities. These images, while powerful, can make the suffering and deaths of individuals, even children, seem abstract. But these individuals are someone's loved ones. These children had names, including Carlos Hernandez Vasquez, who was 16 when he died, Felipe Alonso Gomez, who died at 8 years old, and Jacqueline Kyle Makian, who was just 7 years old when she died in CBP custody. The bill we are considering today will not bring them back, but it will help make certain that no other child or parent in CBP custody dies for lack of an appropriate medical screening or access to medical care. Whatever the President might say, CBP custody facilities are not overcrowded and under-resourced because too many people are seeking protection from conflict and violence on our southern border. These facilities are overwhelmed because the administration has made the unnecessary jailing of children and families the center of its immigration policy. There is much we could do instead, such as more rapid adjudication of asylum cases and the release of some families pending their hearings. Instead of doing the hard work of responding to and managing the challenges at our border, the administration is focused on dehumanizing immigrants with all too tragic results. But this bill does not deal with the causes of that crisis. This bill deals simply with the people in custody. Our colleague, the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, a medical doctor and the author of this legislation, has put in the effort that the administration apparently lacks the will or the ability to do. H.R. 3239 is designed to ensure that CBP facilities protect the health and safety of both immigrant and CBP officers and to prevent needless deaths. It requires CBP to partner with professionals in emergency response, healthcare, and child welfare so that CBP agents can return to their primary role of protecting the border from real threats, and immigrants can be assessed by professionals, by health professionals, who can make informed decisions. It requires that CBP facilities provide basic human necessities, including sufficient numbers of showers, soap, toothpaste, and clean clothing, so that children and CBP agents do not get sick as a result of unsanitary conditions that are easily cured if planned for and managed well. The bill requires written documentation concerning health screenings, medical care, and medications so that upon arrival at an Immigration and Customs Enforcement or Health and Human Services facility, an immigrant's health status is already known and staff can prepare appropriately. The administration's enforcement-only policy has already needlessly filled up facilities with men, women, and children who simply do not need to be there, and people have been dying as a result. This bill is the first step in preventing additional deaths by ensuring that individuals are held in humane conditions and have access to basic medical care when circumstances warrant. It is the very least we can do as a civilized society. This bill does not deal, unfortunately, with the needlessly filling up of these facilities with men, women, and children who do not need to be there. It simply deals with their health and sanitation needs. I commend Representative Dr. Ruiz for introducing the Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in CBP Custody Act, and I urge all my colleagues to support this important legislation. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, for his opening comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As administration officials,
Opening
always
statement.
short one. No. As administration officials have been saying for months, the current migration flow, and we heard even this earlier this week, is resulting humanitarian crisis have overwhelmed the government's ability to adequately respond. In January, I introduced H.R. 586, which is the Fix the Immigration Loopholes Act, to modernize our laws and address the perverse incentives fueling this illegal immigration that we're seeing and the increase that we're seeing. But however, we've chose not to bring that bill to markup. In fact, we're not even bringing a bill that would be an equivalency from a different perspective. We're marking up no bills that address actually the crisis on what's fueling the large numbers and the problems that we're having to address, I think in an honest way, but also a very misguided way in this bill. In fact, the only bill we passed has actually probably exacerbated the process as we went forward, which was H.R. 6. With the undeniable evidence of the crisis now firmly in the public spotlight, I was hopeful we could finally see a serious effort by both colleagues of both sides to end this crisis, Democrats included, and especially since you control the markup schedule. Instead, we've decided to mark up H.R. 3239, a bill that will do absolutely nothing to address the root causes of the crisis, and in fact, will make it worse. As the system was intended to work, individuals encountered by the Customs and Border Protection remain in CBP custody for short periods of time to complete processing, generally no more than 72 hours. Individuals are then transferred to ICE custody in the case of adults, HHS in case of kids or children, or released. But the enormous, unprecedented numbers of migrants crossing have overwhelmed the system. The ICE detention and HHS shelters are full, and CBP currently releases virtually all family units as soon as the processing stage is completed. In short, what the administration officials have been warning has come true. The system is broken. But we're not marking up a bill to fix legal loopholes incentivizing mass illegal migration. No, we're marking up the Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in Customs and Border Protection Custody Act, a bill that with a nice name, but is actually unworkable in many ways. And it would have significantly severely impact the CBP, but we're also in this debate not talking about the effects it would have on that agency. To be clear, CBP should comply with custodial care requirements set out in their TED standards and should treat all detainees with respect. How is the one-size-fits-all approach in this bill completely unworkable? Let's take a look. The requirements of H.R. 3239 apply to hundreds of CBP facilities, no matter how big, small, urban, remote, or how busy or how idle. For instance, even though we keep offering my colleagues offer antidotes from the southern border, this bill would apply to the very busy airports such as Hartsfield-Jackson in my home state of Georgia, which sees millions of passengers a year, or an extremely remote port of entry like the Port Poker Creek in Alaska, which is only open for a few months a year, or a Border Patrol substation like Big Bend, Texas, which normally houses no more than 10 detainees per day, or an isolated forward operating base like Camp Bounds in Arizona, or a seaport like Port Ferry in Washington, or even the Truth or Consequences Border Patrol checkpoint in New Mexico. You see what I'm saying? As the men and women of the CBP are doing everything they possibly can to confront the crisis, H.R. 3239 would impose burdensome and often impossible standards of care onto these facilities. In addition to initial medical screening of all migrants entering CBP custody, H.R. 3239 would require CBP to provide additional for free the alien medical services. The bill states where practicable, CBP shall have on-site, in addition to licensed medical professionals, they already have to conduct medical screenings, licensed emergency care professionals, specialty physicians, including physicians specializing in pediatric, family medicine, obstetric and gynecology, geriatric medicine, internal medicine, and infectious diseases, nurse practitioners and other nurses and physicians' assistants, licensed social workers, mental health professionals, public health professionals, dietitians, interpreters, and chaperones. If impractical to have them on site, CBP must have them on call. Our Border Patrol should be out doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that is protecting our border, interdicting narcotics, preventing the illegal immigration, and stopping child trafficking, not setting up the hospitals that they're not equipped to do at every single facility. The bill would also prevent CBP from housing individuals outside of temporary facilities and require all facilities to be climate controlled while simultaneously limiting the number of CBP processing facility can house. CBP will therefore be forced to release even more people into the U.S. interior, since this bill would limit its ability to respond to migrant surges. The bill also mandates the provision of showers and that may not be appropriate in some areas of custodial setting, and it even mandates the number is specifically enough to the toilet detainee ratio. Perhaps the worst part about this bill is it increases the incentive to exploit children to gain interest in the United States. Smugglers know migrants will be released to the U.S. interior if they bring a child because of the legal loophole created by the Flores Settle Agreement. The loophole currently only applies to parents and legal guardians. DHS continues to see adults fraudulently posing as child's parents or legal guardian to use the child to get into the United States. This bill rips the existing loophole even further. Instead, only benefiting parents and legal guardians, the bill would expand to mere adult relatives of the child. H.R. 3239, although possibly well-intentioned and is well-intentioned, is unworkable. Will do nothing to address the border crisis, increases the likelihood for children to be trafficked because of the openings that it provides. I again, will vote no on this bill for the many reasons that I've just stated, but also would encourage us to look, instead of always at the symptoms of the problem, let's look at fixing the problem. I have ideas, you have ideas, let's bring those to the table and have those discussions. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we have the opportunity to pass a piece of legislation that will prevent the deaths of children in our immigration detention system. Without H.R. 3239, it is a certainty that more children and other immigrants will fail to get adequate treatment, and some will die in Customs and Border Protection custody. The bill is a life-saving piece of legislation rooted in the long medical experience of our colleague, Representative Raul Ruiz, and responsive to the needs of the children and families in CBP custody. The Trump administration's immigration policies have intentionally dehumanized immigrant children and families and pushed them into severely crowded CBP cells where many are forced to stand for weeks on end. The administration asserts that these conditions are the inevitable result of large numbers of people seeking protection at our border, but that's not true. A competent administration would plan for the expected arrival and care of immigrants in need of protection. It would staff child welfare and healthcare professionals at CBP facilities so that our CBP agents could focus on their mission of vigilance, integrity, and professionalism. A capable administration would support CBP agents in the identification of individuals who pose a risk to our country and facilitate the release of families and individuals who pose no risk so that overcrowding is not an issue. The Trump administration has done none of this, and so CBP agents are guarding families instead of the border and administering punishment on children instead of going after criminals. This does nothing to protect the United States, but it does undermine the mission, morale, integrity, and professionalism of CBP officers. It's got to stop. This bill cuts through the Trump administration's incompetence and restores order and basic humanity to the processing of immigrants at the border. It requires that each CBP facility include at least one medical professional. It could be a nurse practitioner, an EMT, to conduct health screenings for individuals upon arrival. It mandates that other emergency care professionals be immediately available so that if a life-threatening situation arises, it can be addressed quickly instead of hours later at a hospital. The bill prohibits the severe overcrowding of children, families, and single adults, which has become the norm in CBP custody facilities, which exposes immigrants as well as our staff to health and safety concerns. The bill requires that clean clothing and nutritious food be made available to immigrants in CBP custody so that they are no longer forced to eat bologna sandwiches at every meal and wear clothing soiled from the sweat and heat of overcrowding. In short, this bill is the plan for CBP custody that the Trump administration seems incapable of putting together. I'd like to recommend Representative and Dr. Raul Ruiz for his effort and commitment to the safety and dignity of every person, regardless of their origin. And I would urge my colleagues to support this bill. The crisis that we see at the border, and we had a hearing, a subcommittee hearing just this Monday, a report from the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security with simply shocking reports of overcrowding and unacceptable conditions that violate the standards of the department. If we do not act, more people will sicken and die. I'm mindful that these conditions are a choice that the Trump administration has made. While people have piled up in these border facilities, empty space was available in ICE facilities. I'm mindful that in 2014, when there was a surge of immigrants coming to our southern border, the Obama administration constructed an overflow facility that housed over 1,000 people in 10 days to avoid the kind of disorder that the president has allowed to be created because of the asylum seekers. So we need to put some order into this situation. If the president's administration can't manage this, the Congress needs to step in, and I would urge that we pass this bill. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. I now recognize the ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For months now, Republicans have raised the alarm about a crisis at the border. Our colleagues ignored the issue, and some even claimed it was a manufactured crisis. 5 months ago, this committee heard from Carla Provost, the chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. What did she tell us? There was a security and humanitarian crisis at the border. What did the majority do? Nothing. This committee also heard testimony from Commander White of the Public Health Service Commission Corps. What did he tell us? HHS was maintaining double the number of beds for unaccompanied minors as compared to 17 months prior, in October 2017. UAC numbers were historically high. UACs were held in custody nearly 50% longer than in fiscal year 2018. The majority did not hear these pleas either. In fact, on the very same day that Chief Provost and Commander White testified, the majority voted against the president's emergency declaration to address the crisis. Earlier this year, the majority passed a bill to actually cut funding for ICE detention beds. One article suggested the Democrats' bill would encourage ICE to detain fewer immigrants and asked, will it work? We now know the answer. No, it has not worked. This Congress, this majority, has been derelict in its duties. Finally, the majority brought forth a bill related to the border. This proves one thing: the majority finally admits we have a problem at our southern border. Unfortunately, because of how bad this bill is, it also proves the majority still don't understand the cause of the crisis. For the past 2 days, the Immigration Subcommittee has heard about the crisis and strain on the system. We have heard policies enacted by Congress can and have made things worse. This bill, which is completely unworkable, won't fix the current problem. It will only make them worse. It wouldn't be the first time the majority pushed a solution that made matters at the border worse. Take, for example, the situation involving unaccompanied minors. That problem was made worse, much worse, by legislation passed in 2008. In 2008, there were 8,041 unaccompanied minors at the border. Last fiscal year, there were 50,036, more than a 622% increase. We cannot afford to make the same kind of mistakes at the border, mistakes that will make the crisis worse, but that is exactly what this bill is poised to do. Customs and Border Patrol was not asked for input on the implications of this bill. Let me repeat, CBP was never consulted about this bill, and yet it will have a sweeping and devastating impact on how that agency fulfills its vital duties. The committee has never had a hearing on this legislation. The majority apparently is uninterested in hearing from experts about the provisions of this bill. This bill expands the Flores loophole, allowing distant relatives to use children to enter the U.S. This will increase the risk and incidence of child trafficking at a time where some media reports have suggested DNA tests show nearly 1/3 of children apprehended at the border are not related to the person who claimed a family relationship. This bill would nearly immediately require every CBP facility, whether it is a Border Patrol station, port of entry, checkpoint, forward operating base, and secondary inspection stations, to have a large array of medical staff on site or on call at all times, even in the most remote areas along the border. It will nearly immediately impose building standards on the Border Patrol, even though it will likely take the agency years to acquire, build, or contract with third parties to obtain these facilities. What will the effect of this be? CBP will have to release aliens caught at the border into the U.S. This bill is a veiled effort to create the progressives' ultimate dream of open borders. I would ask the chairman and the majority to hold a hearing on this bill before we continue this markup. Let's hear from the experts, and then let us move a bipartisan bill that fixes Flores, sets standards to reduce frivolous asylum claims, and truly secures our border. If we can do those things, we can reduce some of the factors driving the border crisis. This will make things manageable for Customs and Border Patrol. It will help reduce overcrowding at CBP, ICE, and HHS facilities. It will help reduce the number of people who are risking their lives by paying smugglers to help them traverse through dangerous deserts. A bill that reduces the drivers of illegal immigration will save lives. There is a better way. I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3239, offered by Mr. Nadler. Strike all that follows after the enacting clause and insert the following.
To deal with Flores. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will recognize myself to explain the amendment. Most of the changes in this amendment are either of a technical nature or simply clarify the intent of certain provisions. For example, the bill refers to infants, toddlers, children, and minors under the age of 17 as vulnerable populations. The amendment replaces each of these words with child, consistent with the definition of a child in the Immigration and Nationality Act. Aside from these more technical revisions, the amendment makes three substantive changes. The first change concerns the amount of private space afforded to each individual in custody. The bill requires 2 square meters of space per individual. The amendment revises this to require that no individual be placed in a room if it would exceed the maximum occupancy determined by the appropriate building code or the fire marshal. If a facility is nearing maximum capacity, the amendment permits CBP to contract for the construction of additional temporary facilities. Congress just recently appropriated an additional $4.5 billion so that agencies can do this contingency planning, thereby avoiding dangerous overcrowding. The second substantive, I should add, I note that the distinguished gentleman from Colorado said that it took years to construct such a facility. The distinguished gentlelady, the subcommittee chair, pointed out that in the Obama administration, they constructed such a facility in 10 days. If they can do it in 10, we can do it in 9. The second substantive change amends the amount of time in which CBP is required to conduct an initial health screening. As originally drafted, the bill required that all individuals be screened within 12 hours of apprehension and within 3 hours for vulnerable populations. The amendment requires that all individuals be screened within 12 hours of entering a CBP facility and within 6 hours for vulnerable populations. The final change adds language requiring that members of Congress have access to any Customs and Border Protection facility. These changes are relatively minor and all improve the bill. Therefore, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute and yield back the balance of my time. I will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Collins, for any comments he may have on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree it meets the standard, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the
Chairman?
nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have
The gentlelady is recognized.
an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3239,
Ask
offered by
unanimous
Ms.
consent
Lofgren.
that the amendment be considered as read. These are
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized in support of her amendment.
These amendments are technical in nature. They've been shared with the minority, and I think, although members of the minority may oppose the overall amendment, do not disagree that this actually refines, in a sensible way, the understanding of the amendment. So I would offer this as a clarifying technical amendment and ask that it be adopted.
Gentlelady Hill.
Yes.
Okay, look, we'll stipulate on the fact that it is, that there are technical changes. Well, I would disagree with the bill as a whole, and we'll still vote against it. This doesn't help it, but it is only technical amendments, and I'll stipulate to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize myself to strike the last word in support of the amendment. As the chair of the Immigration Subcommittee has stated, this amendment makes mostly technical and non-substantive changes to the bill and corrects a number of minor drafting errors. I appreciate the gentlelady offering this amendment, which improves the bill. I encourage my colleagues to support it, and I thank the gentleman, the ranking member, for indicating that he would support this technical amendment. I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any further comments on this amendment? The gentlelady for what purpose does the gentlelady from Washington seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the chairwoman of the Immigration Subcommittee for this technical amendment. I am in support of it. I just wanted to say a few words on the underlying bill. I am proud that we're marking up this bill today to create some meaningful standards for how CBP treats people in its custody. Frankly, we shouldn't have to do this, but we are in a position where we are forced to do this. We have to say that we cannot tolerate people and children being held in conditions where children are forced to wear, quote, clothing stained with vomit, where people are forced to share combs during a lice outbreak, where facilities lack adequate food, water, and sanitation, and where Border Patrol agents are asking children to care for other children with little to no help from any adult. And I just saw an article today that says that Border Patrol turned to a 3-year-old and asked if she wanted to stay with one parent who was being deported or the other parent who was going to be kept here in the United States. It is unacceptable that at least 7 children have died in the last year when no child had died in DHS custody for nearly 10 years. So these standards are absolutely necessary. And just last week, ProPublica reported that Border Patrol agents are handing out commemorative coins to mock their duty to care for the children in their custody. So this is an important first step to address conditions at the border, but it can't be the last. We do also have to address other issues. First, very worrying reports that overcrowding at the border is being manufactured by this administration. And I would just cite to you, Border Patrol claimed on July 4th that HHS did not have the capacity to accept unaccompanied children, but in a July 10th BuzzFeed news story, HHS refuted Border Patrol's claim and said that they had beds available. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the BuzzFeed news article entitled Border Patrol said there wasn't room for more immigrant kids. The shelter agency says otherwise.
Without objection.
The Wall Street Journal drew attention to information that, quote, several facilities run by immigration authorities that are intended for children were not being fully used for that purpose, end quote. As of June 27th, as the nation reeled at images of severe overcrowding and harsh conditions for children and others, family detention facilities were actually running at under half capacity. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record that Wall Street Journal article entitled, As Border Crisis Worsens, a Detention Center Designed for Children Has None.
Without objection.
Policies like metering, the attempts by the Trump administration, no, not the attempts, the actual rules by the Trump administration to say that we are shutting down the ability for people to enter through legal ports of entry and therefore to seek asylum, and therefore they are going between legal ports of entry and crossing over the border in dangerous conditions such that we had people dying crossing the river. Those kinds of policies, along with limiting or even eliminating the ability for legal asylum seekers to seek asylum, policies like Remain in Mexico, these are policies like mass prosecutions of people who are crossing the border, that has not been done before. So these are the kinds of policies, along with addressing root causes in the sending countries, that are creating this giant chaos at the border. So yes, it is a manufactured crisis, by this administration. We also have to address the massive over-incarceration of people in immigration detention centers, and we will be having a hearing on conditions of detention and detention facilities later in this committee, but these are things that would be addressed through my bill with Congressman Adam Smith called Dignity for Detained Immigrants. And I don't think the majority of Americans understand that the 56,000 people every day who are being held in prisons, we call them detention, but they are actually in some cases prisons, that the vast majority of those people don't have a conviction, much less a charge against them, other than perhaps illegal reentry or entry. So these are not people that should be detained. Many of them are asylum seekers. Many of them are people who, if we adjusted our immigration laws, and let me remind this committee once again, that in 2013, there was a bipartisan bill to comprehensively reform our immigration system. It was passed with 68 bipartisan votes, and guess who held it up in this chamber? Speaker John Boehner. Republicans have refused repeatedly to comprehensively reform the immigration system in a just and humane way. So I think this is a very important bill that we're passing, but it's certainly not the end, and I resent any implications that somehow Republicans have been trying to fix this problem. There has been no attempt to do so. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this bill should not be controversial. This is America, and we can provide clean drinking water, 3 decent meals, a place to sleep with the lights off, and a place to shower once a day. Customs and Border Protection's own standards require some of these same basic elements of care. The Department of Homeland Security already agreed it must relieve dangerous overcrowding at its Del Norte processing center. The standards set by these agencies themselves are not being met. These are children. These are children who are scared to death and families who've run away from violence. This isn't a problem in the future. It's a problem right now. And if we don't act now, I fear our failure risks the deaths of more innocent children. And I pray that these standards are met, Mr. Chairman, because I fear the consequences if we don't meet just these basic human needs. And I yield back the balance of my time.
By the gentlelady from California. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Gentleman from Florida, for what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
Clerk will report the amendment. The gentlelady reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3239, offered by Mr. Gates of Florida.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a crisis at our southern border. It is a crisis that Secretary McAleenan shared with this body repeatedly starting back in February. It is a crisis that House Democrats have ignored, and it is even a crisis that the Democratic whip laughed at. I repeat, laughed at on January 9th when asked whether there was a humanitarian crisis. To solve the crisis, we need to change our asylum laws. We need to erect physical barriers on the border, and we need a common sense immigration enforcement regime that allows for interior enforcement of our immigration laws and support for Customs and Border Patrol and ICE. These statements didn't used to be controversial. Just way back in the 1990s, the distant 1990s, Democrats included in their official platform that criminal illegal aliens needed to be deported. And obviously, you need the elements of ICE to be able to do that, and you need strong CBP to ensure that we have a secure border. But now, Some on the radical left have substantially moved the Democratic Party in a dangerous direction. They say that interior enforcement of our immigration laws is racist. They say that building a wall is racist. And despite the fact that a substantial percentage of the brave Americans who work at ICE and CBP are of some minority status, there are claims that these institutions of ICE and CBP are in and of themselves racist. Those claims are absurd. These are patriotic Americans doing all they can to be helpful. But I wonder, where are we in this Congress? Where are House Democrats? Because as I've seen the new spokespeople for the Democratic Party, the Squad, step forward and call for the abolition of ICE, the abolition of the Department of Homeland Security, and the abolition of Customs and Border Patrol, I wonder, what elements of the securing of our border or the enforcement of our immigration laws would any of you even stand to support? And so I bring this amendment, largely demonstrably, to see who among the Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee agree with the most radical fringe on the Democratic left. So this amendment would do as the Squad has called for. It would abolish CBP. And I'd like to know who among you stand with the brave Americans who toe the line, who work the border, who enforce our laws, and who among you stand with the Squad. I can't wait to find out, and I certainly hope that my Democratic colleagues will not use procedural maneuvers to block consideration and to figure out which side of the line you're on. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on her point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. The amendment is beyond the scope of the bill and the manager's amendment, which relates to the conditions of confinement, and this is far beyond germane. I would say, however, if it were germane, I would vote against this amendment because obviously we need to have border patrol agents and an agency to enforce border security. So I do insist on my point of order.
Does the gentleman wish to be heard on the point of order? On the point of order.
I'm aware, Mr. Chairman, yes. I am disappointed that the gentlelady insists on her point of order, but given those remarks, I'll withdraw the amendment.
Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Very well. I will rule on the, let me just say that, that this is well out of order, and I'm glad that the gentleman will seek unanimous consent to withdraw it. I doubt anybody would vote for it on this side of the aisle. I'm glad to hear that the gentleman from Florida thinks we ought to abolish the CBP. But I think most people think we need a border patrol. But the gentleman seeks unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment. After having wasted the committee's time, I am glad to, without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, for what purpose is the gentleman from California?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the
reserve a
nature
point
of a
of order.
substitute.
Gentlelady reserves a point of order. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to
Chairman,
the
I
amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3239, offered by Mr. Swalwell of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
The gentleman from, first of all, the gentleman from Georgia also reserves a point of order, and without objection, the reading will be dispensed with. The gentleman from California is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would require the Government Accountability Office to examine whether in implementation of this bill, Customs and Border Patrol agents making abusing, prejudicial, discriminatory, or other similar comments, including on social media. And so, essentially, Mr. Chairman, in light of overwhelming evidence in the last few months that there are secret online Facebook pages where members of CBP are making inflammatory statements about immigrants, inflammatory statements about members of Congress who have oversight ability, that this should be a part of what GAO looks at. But stepping back, Mr. Chairman, I do want to thank the chairman and Dr. Ruiz for bringing forth this legislation. There's nothing easy about what is happening at our southern border. And I have recently visited the San Diego sector. I've visited Miss Mercasal Powell's district, and I went to the Homestead detention facility. And there's nothing easy about why these immigrants are coming here. It's actually a lot of the conditions that are going on in the northern triangle of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and a lack of leadership by the United States to address the economic and security conditions there leads to a continued flow. And we can't just go to the border to address this issue, but presidential leadership could actually work with the private sector and other countries to invest in those countries and make sure that people can stay where they're from, which is overwhelmingly what they would prefer to do if it was safe and if there was opportunity. But recognizing that right now we have no leadership, that people will continue to take a 1,000+ mile journey, and who among us would not do the same if we had nothing and we feared for our lives? And who among us would think that coming to the United States and facing separation would probably still be safer than what we would be leaving behind? That's why most of these individuals come. So they are at our border. There's nothing easy about why they are coming here, but when it comes to the conditions they should face when they arrive here, that call should be easy. And what I see at these facilities is not easy to see or process. To see in a room half the size of the room that we sit in today, dozens of people who have not had showers for weeks. They're wearing the same clothes they wore weeks before when they first presented to our country. No beds, space blankets, little access to food and water. And the thousands of people in the communities around them who want to send in humanitarian resources are being denied the opportunity to send in humanitarian resources. And those are just the adults. Then there's the children in the cages who are subjected to days on days without showers, without the lights being turned off when they go to sleep, without the bed that we would expect and give a prisoner accused of the worst crime in the United States. It's easy for all of us, I believe, it should be easy to say that they deserve better and they deserve humanitarian conditions when they present. There's nothing easy about why they came. There's nothing easy about what we should do to process their claims, but it is easy. It's an easy call as to how we should treat them when they're in our custody. And it's also an easy call as to how we should expect the custodians of these facilities to treat them. I have all the respect in the world, Mr. Chairman, for the men and women of law enforcement. I'm the son of a cop. My brothers are cops. I worked as a prosecutor. I've worked with our CBP agents. I've gone across the border with them. It's a tough job, hot, straining conditions. And overwhelmingly, most of them show up to work every day and they do their job with pride. But what I see on these Facebook pages does not rise to the level of what we should expect from these individuals. And these are the individuals that we are trusting to take care of these children and these fleeing refugee adults. And so my amendment would ask that GAO look at these Facebook pages and to find if there's anyone else who we've trusted to take care of these individuals who are engaging in this conduct. And if so, hopefully CBP would take action to remove them. And so that they do not stain the good reputations of the overwhelming majority of CBP agents who want to just do their job, protect people, protect our country, and protect these children. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady from California insist on her point of order?
No, Mr. Chairman, we did call the parliamentarian who advises us that the amendment is germane, so I withdraw my point of order.
Gentlelady withdraws her point of order. Does the gentleman from Georgia insist on his point of order?
I will withdraw my point of order, but I do have a question, and just as a clarification question, I'm assuming the way that the gentleman from California worded this, he is talking about prospective and not regressive acts. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. I withdraw the point of order.
The point of order is withdrawn. Is there any further?
Move to strike last
Does
word.
anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Gentleman from Florida. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with the gentleman from California that no one working within our government should utilize social media to harass or engage in these types of social media comments. This is now the second time in this committee hearing that the chairman has accused a member of the minority of wasting time. It was Ms. Lesko's amendment earlier in this Congress where when the chairman called for the amendment, the chairman characterized it as frivolous. And members of the minority will take no lecture from this chairman when it comes to wasting this committee's time. The chairman of this committee has scheduled 3 hearings on the Mueller report without providing a fact witness before the committee and the country that could even speak to the Mueller report. The chairman called back Ms. Hicks for an 8-hour interview and found no new information, no new facts. And so as we're dealing with a real crisis on the border, as we're dealing with real challenges that this committee could work for, the leadership of this committee seems so focused on this crazy witch hunt. They're so unwilling to bend to the overwhelming will of the American people, 6 of 10 of whom oppose the opening of an impeachment inquiry, that you continue to waste our time, you continue to ignore the problems, and we will take no lecture from you when it comes to the utility of our contributions to this committee. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady from
I
California.
move to strike the last word. I don't object to having a study of this. I would note that the department itself is investigating the social media material that has been reported on and is, I guess without doubt, I mean, they were very problematic. I would note also that the Inspector General advised us on Monday that the Inspector General's office would be looking into those allegations. So I feel some level of confidence that we will get to the bottom of what has happened in the past, and I would assume that all of us would want to know that and make sure that appropriate action is taken. And
The gentlelady yield.
I would be happy.
And I think I agree with the gentlelady because I've had reports just as you have that they are looking into this, and that's why I ask, is this a progressive? And I think what this was trying to get at, and I understand the gentleman's sentiment, and I agree with my friend from Florida, and also agree with his statements just now about the first comments coming from the chair that are editorializing many times the statements on our side, and you and I have talked about this, and I would hope it would stop. It doesn't seem to be, but it continues. But then this here, I think, is, again, I think we're going to get to the bottom. I agree with the gentlelady from California. I think this is a priority for the department in the light of everything else that's going on. And frankly, would just say that this is going to get to the bottom. I'm not sure how this would, help what is already a flawed bill. Yield back.
I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Virginia, for what purpose? The gentleman from Virginia seek
move to
recognition?
strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to support the amendment, but in light of the gentleman from Florida's comments and others that were made, I just wanted to point out that this is already against the law when it comes to federal employees, and from the gentlelady's comments, it's already being investigated. So, I'm happy to support the repeat of this policy and the continued application of this policy, but it does seem like it's repetitive, but I'll support the amendment. Thank you. Yield back.
Question occurs on the amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the
I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment. The gentlelady from California reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3239, offered by Mr. Biggs.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment replaces the words adult relative with parent to ensure that children are kept together with their parents or legal guardians in CBP custody, and not just with any adult relative. In my multitude of visits to the border and detention facilities and watching people surrendering, I have always been astounded at that there almost always is an even number of adult people with children. And that's done because of our current longstanding practice that family units consist of a parent or legal guardian, but we're only able to confirm a parent-child relationship through birth certificates, legal documents, and in some limited cases through DNA testing. But now this bill would require CBP to consider any adult relative of a child or a human trafficker and posing as an adult relative of a child to be part of a family unit. This year alone, more than 5,000 children as parts of false family units have been found out and protected from the human trafficker that was using them to create a family unit. That would not be possible, quite frankly, under 3239. The outer limits of the relationship is left undefined. Is it brothers and sisters? Is it aunts and uncles? To what degree of consanguinity do we even consider? Presumably even distant relatives. Of course, it would be ideal for children to stay with their adult relatives in a perfect world, but we don't live in such a world. We live in a world where children are exploited and trafficked, a world where our laws incentivize the use of a child to illegally enter the United States. I spoke recently about a young girl, 11 years old, who was being kept in Charleston, South Carolina, who had been used and manipulated and exploited by human traffickers. She was there responsible for two children, two small boys, who were awaiting reuse by human traffickers from the Yuma port of entry. Fortunately, CBP, together with ICE, local LEOs, and FBI, were able to go in and save those three children. There's already a loophole in immigration law created by the Flores Settlement Agreement that prevents children from being detained with their parents for longer than 20 days. The practical effect of this loophole is that virtually no family unit is detained. This incentivizes individuals to bring a child with them when they cross the border to ensure they are released into the interior of the country. That incentive is so great that human traffickers refer to children as passports, and DHS has identified an increasing number of fraudulent cases where adults pose as a child's parent or legal guardian in order to gain entry into the United States. The language in this allows them to expand who would be considered the family unit. The incentive to bring a child will be exacerbated. While DHS's efforts to identify a true relationship and prevent the trafficking of children for nefarious purposes would be made even more difficult. This new requirement will incentivize child traffickers to pose as distant relatives to evade detection, and this is unacceptable. We should be closing legal loopholes like the Flores Settlement Agreement, not expanding them. This amendment does not end the Flores Settlement Agreement, but it would at least keep the status quo, ensuring that children stay together with their parents and legal guardians without extending the legal loophole to distant relatives and human traffickers who would fraudulently pose as such relatives to bring children into the United States for nefarious purposes. I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment to ensure that we're protecting children, not creating more reasons for under our laws to exploit children. And I just want to make an additional comment that illegal reentry into the United States of America is a felony. And I want to bring two important cases from my own district where someone who committed that felony of reentry, who had been deported, come back, murdered Grant Ronnebeck, the son of Steve Ronnebeck, and another who had also been deported and reentered, committing that felony of reentry, killed Brandon Mendoza, son of Marianne Mendoza, in my district. And so I think it's important to never forget the separation that occurred for the Ronnebeck and the Mendoza families. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentlemen, yield.
Yes, I'll yield to the...
I just want to say quickly without striking next time, I agree with the gentleman's amendment. This is, at this time, I believe rapid DNA, other things need to come into contact here, but at this time, expanding this in this bill is not helpful and would actually exacerbate a problem. I think there needs to be a better solution. It should not be in this bill, and the expansion should not be here. With that, I yield back to the gentleman.
Gentleman yields back. First, I withdraw my point of order. Obviously, the amendment is germane. I would urge opposition to the amendment and explain why I think, although I'm
Regular
sure...
order, Madam Chair.
Pardon me?
I think you have to recognize yourself.
I thought I had recognized myself for as much time as for 5 minutes. The amendment, although I'm sure well-intended, I think creates problems that would not be suitable. Right now, as the bill stands, a family member, and this is quite frequent, a grandmother, an aunt, an older sibling may be accompanying a minor child. And what is happening is that children are being removed from their grandmother and then, in many cases, lost in the Trump administration's mismanaged and I would say incompetent immigration system. We have received reports that there are still thousands of children, some of them pre-verbal, who have been separated from their families and never reunited. In fact, the Inspector General pointed out that the Border Patrol for pre-verbal children didn't even take pictures or fingerprints of the babies, and so there was no way to reunite these babies with their parents. The need to make sure that children are not separated from their family and then lost in the system is an urgent one. This bill does not change or improve on any substantive rights of adults, but it is necessary to safeguard immigrant children because it's been proven that this administration can't or won't protect these children once they enter the system. I would note that the issue of trafficking is a real one, and the manager's amendment notes that if the arrangement poses a safety or security concern, then the measure would not be adhered to. I would note further the mention of rapid DNA, which I believe is being unfolded out at the border. This is something that Mr. Sensenbrenner and I worked on, and it's an important advance to determining identity of individuals. It's something that's relatively inexpensive. It can be operated within minutes by non-technical people. It's simply a machine. It's being used by the FBI and in other countries with a high degree of reliability in terms of identification. So that is a very large advance. And so although I know the amendment is well-intentioned, I think it would do harm to children, and I would urge that we oppose that amendment. And with that, I yield back. Are there other members who wish to be heard on the amendment? The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Wish to strike the last word. For the chair to say this administration can't or won't help the children protect the children after they're separated, that's been proven, is a statement that is really unbecoming the chair. I have personally seen many efforts to protect the children by our Border Patrol and by ICE. And it is an affront to those people who are not paid enough for the hell they go through trying to enforce our laws to say they can't or won't protect these children. That's really, there are cases where they haven't gotten the protection that we would
Would the gentleman
want.
yield?
But that, yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. To clarify, and I perhaps did not make this as clear as necessary, it was the Inspector General of the department itself that identified that pre-verbal children had been removed from their parents without any identifiers, either a written record, a picture.
That's not every child, though. That's my point.
And I don't want to say every child, but children have been lost in the system, and in fact, over 1,000 are still lost in the system.
Reclaiming my
And I
time, the
yield back.
statement was that this administration can't or won't help these children pre-verbal, and they help them every single day. There are cases where they haven't gotten the protection that they should have. There were cases that I observed, the cages that were built by the Obama administration, seeing those overcrowded firsthand, having the Obama administration officials trying to keep me out of those facilities. I saw all that. But those poor Border Patrolmen were doing the best they could in almost every situation. They're trying, but it doesn't help when we have people up here encouraging people who are breaking our laws to resist our law enforcement. It's a wonder that every Border Patrolman doesn't have PTSD. They're trying to enforce the law we hired them and pay them to enforce, while we have people in this Capitol, on Capitol Hill, that are elected servants, and they're telling people to resist the Border Patrol, resist ICE. I mean, it is absolutely insane. They're doing the best they can, and I would, nearly all of them are doing the best they can under horrible conditions, and when they're not even being given the money they need to address these situations. I know there are people on the other side think to address the situation means you just let everybody out, whether they're MS-13ers, they're about to kill or cause harm, but we hire people to enforce our laws. And I'd like to yield the rest of my time to Mr. Biggs from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman for yielding time to me. And I just want to point out that when the representative from California talks about the situation where you might have a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle who is there with the child, the problem with the bill as constructed is you've not defined what an adult relative is. You just haven't done that. And you're asking Border Patrol people, and by the way, I get down to the border often, and a lot of these folks coming over, they have documents as they're transiting Mexico. They come and they destroy their documents on the southern side of the border, and then when they come in, there is no authentication, there's no proof of who is related to whom. And that gets to your point of maybe rapid DNA might be appropriate. But that isn't in this bill. You haven't defined what an adult relative is. In fact, you've actually expanded this thing out that you're going to get people claiming, because there's no line of demarcation in the line of consanguinity anywhere. So what that's going to do is that allows people to manipulate this system and will actually be, quite frankly, a further magnet, an incentive to come here, because we will have lost even more control over what defines a family unit. And so I think that's why my amendment is so important, and I would urge a passage of the amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes. To strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Move to strike the last word. I'd like to ask my colleagues to please vote against the amendment and to support the underlying bill for a couple of reasons. And I first want to thank Dr. Raul Ruiz, who drafted this bill after visiting El Paso and touring the sector with me and with other members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and then sitting down and meeting with the folks on staff at those facilities, and also meeting with families who had been in our detention. Next week, hopefully this bill will be on the House floor, and we'll have significant support from both parties. My bill, also the Homeland Security Improvement Act, will hopefully be on the floor next week, and will hopefully have support from both parties. You know, I think one of the things that frustrates the American public about Washington, and it frustrates me as well, and I find myself guilty of participating in this as well, is a lot of looking in the rearview mirror of who said what, who did what. The American public wants us to solve problems, and I think we all want to do that. I want to believe that that's what everybody in Congress wants to do. We have an opportunity. A couple weeks ago, we passed a supplemental bill. It was a Senate bill, a border supplemental, that unfortunately did not have standards, but the funding has been provided. What this bill and what my bill can do and will do next week is increase standards for those in our custody, and also, through my bill, increase oversight, transparency, and accountability. And I'll tell you, I'm approaching this not just from the perspective of how we should treat migrants in our care and in our custody, but after having spoken with Border Patrol agent after Border Patrol agent after Border Patrol agent. Agents that we go to church with, agents who are our neighbors, agents who live in my community. And my community, El Paso, has been ground zero for many of the atrocities that have shocked the conscience of the American public. So how do we take action? How do we go forward? This is an important step. But to the amendment specifically, and the reason why I think it would be, I'm not at all, I think Mr. Biggs is coming from a good place, and I appreciate what he's trying to point out. But the danger and the risk with approving this amendment by limiting keeping a family together to a parent and a child is that that doesn't recognize the reality of many of the people and the families arriving at our front door. I have spoken to a grandmother who's had to raise her grandchild because her daughter was murdered. That's a family. I have spoken to a brother who he and his sister made the trek together because they had no other choice. That's a family. I have spoken to an aunt with her niece who fled Central America because they had no other alternative. That's a family. The minute that we limit the definition of family, what we will do is cause more family separation. We will cause more overcrowding in our detention facility because we will have increased the number of single adults, and we will have more children in our care that this government doesn't know what to do with. So I would urge that we think about how we can best work together to address this great challenge, how we do right by our country, how we do right by our founding values, and recognize that the people arriving at our front door, while they present a challenge, they are not a threat to us, and that we stop treating them as though they are.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I yield.
First of all, let me thank the gentlelady for her words and also indicate to my colleagues that I was just in Homeland Security where we were addressing some of these very important issues. I just want to reaffirm the gentlelady's pictorial presentation by my experiences at the border. I think the first stark experience, Congresswoman, was holding 9-month-old Roger in my arms in 2018 in one of the HHS centers. And Roger's mother was dead. His 19-year-old sister was his mother, but she was separated because she was not his mother. But she was his relative. And so I would just simply say I oppose the amendment because the reality is that people are coming with adults that are their relatives and guardians. With that,
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other individuals wishing to strike the last word? Seeing no one, the gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for
Thank
strike
you, Madam
the last
Chair.
word for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I oppose the amendment, and I want to thank the chairman for holding this markup of H.R. 3239, the Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in Customs and Border Protection Custody Act. This legislation ensures that Customs and Border Protection facilities are equipped to meet and deliver basic humanitarian standards of care for detained individuals, including families and children. The fact that we even need this legislation is frankly disturbing and very disappointing. We are currently facing a humanitarian crisis on our southern border. I've been to the border twice, and we've also seen recent media accounts, and I know many of my colleagues have witnessed it as well firsthand, that our current immigration system is failing refugees seeking their legal right to asylum in the United States. The Trump administration's policies have contributed significantly to increases of individuals apprehended at the southern border and have sadly led to several deaths of individuals in CBP custody. The point of this legislation is to prevent further harms to children and families. As we know, these short-term holding facilities under the jurisdictions of Customs and Border Protection are not equipped for the increase of individuals apprehended at the border, but the president continues to push policies that only exacerbate the crisis. Some of CBP's detention facilities were intended for short-term processing stays of 24 to 48 hours, but there are individuals who have been detained in CBP custody in these facilities for 40 days or more. Many of the individuals at our southern border are seeking asylum from unsafe circumstances and conditions they face in their home countries. Families are risking their lives to get into CBP custody. They're fleeing gang violence and death threats. Because of the president's reckless policies, individuals who survive this treacherous journey to the border are faced with prolonged detentions in overcrowded facilities without adequate food and no ready access to water. Individuals are not able to brush their teeth or shower, and they face conditions that make it impossible to adequately rest or sleep. These are not illegals or invaders. These are human beings, and we should never lose sight of that. The people seeking asylum are children and pregnant women, mothers and fathers, the elderly, people with disabilities or special needs. That President Trump would have the Department of Justice lawyers argue before a federal court that necessities like access to water and soap is not necessary for CBP to ensure safe and sanitary conditions for people detained at the border is unacceptable and not who we are as a country. These conditions are inhumane. It's unacceptable to treat people this way. Sadly, these stories are not new, and we must act now. H.R. 3239 takes an important step to begin to address this crisis. It ensures that individuals detained at the border receive timely and appropriate health screenings and care by licensed medical professionals. It guarantees regular access to drinking water, private and secure shower facilities, and products to maintain basic hygiene. It requires basic food and shelter, and among other important protections, mandates that children who arrive with a relative or legal guardian are detained with that relative or legal guardian. Let's be clear, these are not frills, luxuries. These are basic requirements of safety and dignity. And the fact that we even have to have this discussion today makes me sick to my stomach. The administration should be ashamed of the conditions in which it has held these human beings and these children, and the judgment of history will not be kind. While asylum seekers and migrants are in the custody of CBP, it is our responsibility and our legal and moral obligation to make sure they are treated humanely and have access to adequate care. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I thank Dr. Ruiz for his strong leadership, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I strongly oppose this amendment because I think it ignores the realities of the situation at the border. As my colleague from Texas has already said, many times we end up with family members bringing other family members, and it's not a parent and child unit. Often the parent is already here. We need to make the situation better and not worse. This legislation is absolutely critical to address the incompetence of an administration that has created this humanitarian crisis that we're now addressing. Since December 2018, 6 children have died in the custody of U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. 6 children have died in our care. For a decade before that, no children died in U.S. custody, and it's not because this situation is so unique or unprecedented. Prior administrations planned for and dealt with surges, and while their responses may not always have been perfect, no children died. This administration didn't plan for a seasonal surge, and its single-minded focus on an unnecessary and expensive wall between that and making policy changes that have increased detentions and have reduced releases, that's why we're here. The Inspector General in the last 2 months has been forced to issue 2 extraordinary alerts that dangerous overcrowding at these detention centers, which the administration has not moved to address, those dangerous overcrowding conditions have created threats to the health and safety of both detainees and U.S. government employees. And still, no response from this administration. So I strongly support the underlying legislation. I oppose the amendment because it would further exacerbate the situation, and I yield back.
The question occurs on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment say aye. Opposed, no.
No.
The noes have it. Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia, Mr. Deutsch, Ms. Bass, Mr. Richmond, Mr. Jeffries, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Demings. Mr. Correa. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean. Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. McCarcel-Powell. Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes yes. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Gomert votes yes. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes yes. Mr. Ratcliffe. Ms. Roby. Ms. Roby votes yes. Mr. Gates. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes yes. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Ms. Lesko. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no.
Are there any other members who haven't voted who wish to vote? The clerk will report the result. As soon as I announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, there are 8 ayes and 21 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Gentlemen,
I have an amendment to this.
for what purposes, gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
I have 2 amendments in the nature of a, well, I actually have amendments to
An amendment to the amendment nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Amendment to H.R. 3239 as reported, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
We vetted this.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendments, which I understand are being offered en bloc.
Yes.
All right, en bloc.
I thank the gentlelady, and I Delighted that these amendments have been vetted and are prepared in that vein. One is simply to ensure that any video that is in the detention facility must be maintained with certified records for a period of 90 days. It is a question of safety. It is a question of fairness to all parties. It is a question of dealing with those individuals who are both protecting and need to be protected. I'd ask my colleagues, as we pursue improving the standards in these facilities that many of us have already seen, whether it's cleanliness or health care or the interaction with those migrants, that we would want to have the accurate information for all parties to be engaged and to be assured that safety is our highest protocol and highest protected atmosphere. The second, of course, is to make sure that the Detainee Bill of Rights includes all languages and the relevant indigenous languages of the individuals. I was reminded of being in a court proceeding dealing with immigration, and the person from Guatemala was being spoken to in Spanish. They had limited understanding of Spanish. They did have their first language was their indigenous language from Guatemala, which are really the relevant languages that we're speaking of from the Northern Triangle. So I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee amendments, and I yield back my time.
Would the gentlelady yield for a moment, please?
Gentlelady yields.
For a question?
Happy to yield.
Just wondering, does the gentlelady know how many indigenous languages are involved and would be required for this kind of notice?
The way it is articulated, it is for the agency to determine the language relevant in the particular area. In this instance, we're speaking specifically about the language that many Guatemalans speak.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I'll yield. I think it's his.
Oh, no.
Okay.
He yielded back.
No, I'll yield.
I would just note that AT&T, and there may be other providers, provide virtually every language known to man as a service, as an interpretation service. When I was in local government, we used them at the hospital because you couldn't possibly have interpreters for every language. We use them in the court system as well, and they vastly expand the capacity of what you can provide by way of language translation. It's a wonderful service and one that would be utilized, I think, in this case. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
Would the gentlelady yield again?
And I think I just want to comment on the point, and I'll be happy to yield, of Ms. Loughran, and the point that she made is expanded by the new technology that we have that can also dictate the different languages. But yes, to the gentleman.
So it appears from your amendment that you are suggesting that these Bill of Rights in indigenous languages are posted, which would indicate to me that they are in writing. So it's not something, unless the gentlelady is talking about having something read with the interpretation skills that the ranking member, or I'm sorry, the chair is referring to. But these are actually posted on the walls of the detention facility. Is that correct?
If I reclaim my time, if I understand the gentlelady, what she's suggesting, though she's using the technology example, that these indigenous languages are available and would be available to a department as large as the Department of Homeland Security to be able to utilize those that are particularly relevant to those populations that they're dealing with at the border. Reclaiming my time, let me conclude by saying it is fairness. It is a fairness of understanding on both sides. And I have had law enforcement officers express themselves very happily when they come upon a scene or interact with individuals who do not speak English, to be able to engage with them in their language for the fairness of law enforcement and the fairness of the individual that is engaged in an incident or a need. And I think this is one that speaks to the needs at the border, and I'd ask my colleagues to support these two amendments. Safety, protection of all parties involved in the holding of individuals, human beings, at the border. With that, I yield.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I withdraw my point of order. I'm advised that it is in order. Mr. Collins is recognized to strike last word.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Look, the gentlelady from Texas and I, we disagree on this, and I've seen some of it. I think the biggest issues I have here are two things in particular. One, the bill already currently says that there will be, requires installation of video monitoring for detainee protection, which would basically be useless without preservation. I think that's inherent in the bill, but also what's not inherent in the bill. Again, showing why some of this needs to be actually had a hearing and actually worked on a little bit more is the parameters around that hearing. And without conversations with the Customs Border Patrol, we don't know what the capabilities are or the cost, which is another thing that we've conveniently skipped in much of the discussion today is the cost around this. Not saying these are good or bad ideas. The cost is something that we're not talking about as well as how this would actually be done. And as far as the Detainee Bill of Rights Amendment, it requires the Bill of Rights to include all rights afforded detainee in the bill. It requires it to be posted in all areas where the detainees are located and requires the indigenous language. The only question I have here, and I know there's been some discussions back and forth about this, is there's 68 indigenous languages spoken in Mexico alone. 21 Mayan languages in Guatemala, and that's just two of the countries. The United Nations, on one of their handouts, said that there are approximately 67,000 languages spoken around the world, including 4,000 indigenous languages. To include the indigenous language likely to be encountered by CBP, combined with a litany of new requirements imposed on CBP, would simply cover every wall that they have. I don't, for 1 second, disagree with the gentlelady's concern about this. My disagreement with is how this would actually be implemented without logical discussion with CBP, without getting their input, without having this done. I think her concern is genuine. I would never not believe that. I think the only problem in here is implementation, and that does present a problem. And especially when you're looking, for those of us who've dealt with this issue on many years for cameras and reporting, and also requirements, whether it be from officers on patrol to others, there is a huge cost and element here that you have to take into account. And then also, how will they manage this? Are they going to have to contract this out? Because this is not something they do now. Is this something they're going to have to contract out? Or are they going to have to employ these people themselves? I think these are just general questions that need to be asked. That's why I would oppose it. I understand the lady's concern, but I would oppose it in this. There's plenty of opportunities as the line goes down to make other amendments if we come forward. With that, I yield. I yield to Mr. Buck.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just wanted the gentleman to, I wanted to share some information I learned that this past week when the American flag was torn down from an ICE facility in my home state of Colorado and defaced, and the Mexican flag was raised at that facility. One of our colleagues went and visited that facility and learned that there were immigrants from 57 different countries being held at that facility. Now, that doesn't mean that there would be 57 different languages, but there were certainly a number of languages, probably over 30 languages spoken. Those individuals being held, there was no one country that was represented by more than 12% of that population. So the idea that these facilities hold people that speak only a few languages is just not accurate.
Exactly. I appreciate the gentleman, and I think that's also the other thing, and I know it's been discussed and some conversation on how we can make that available. I think this just goes to show there is some more work to be done on this. This is not as simple as answer as having it there, because you have some remote facilities that may not have internet access or anything else to provide that extra access as we go forward. Again, do not question the desire of the gentlelady. I think the problem here is implementation, and that is something that we should always discuss when we're dealing with amendments or bills like this, is implementation. And there's a big enough problem with this bill overall that has not been discussed. So I appreciate the gentleman's concern in that. And with that, I do yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I would ask the gentlelady whether, by unanimous consent, she would take a friendly amendment after the word posted, say, or otherwise made available.
I would be happy to accept the gentlelady's friendly amendment.
And the ranking member said he does not object to the languages either, although he may still have an issue with the amendment.
I thank you.
Madam Chair.
So we, unless there's objection, are you reserving the right to object?
No?
Yes, I'll reserve the right to object. Thank you. I have a question, if I may.
Correct.
The part of the problem is, if you look at indigenous languages, whether it's in Mexico or the Northern Triangle, or even as we see folks coming from Africa or other nations, there's a significant number of those languages that you can't.
That's why you
They're
made
not.
it from the amendment.
They're not written languages.
Correct.
Whether it may be a
Point of order,
hybridization
Madam
or
No, he has
Creole.
reserved the right to object. This is in order.
Okay. And so they may be Creole or something. So when you put that language into this, my question is, how do you ensure that's still workable? Is my
And
question.
if the gentleman would yield,
Absolutely.
the intent would be, you're right, some languages are not written, but through the miracle of technology, virtually every language can be translated. And so you might have the capacity, the amendment is intended to allow a verbal translation, for example, to be a Google Translator to the individual. That would not necessarily have to be a written language or posting.
May I reclaim?
Reclaiming,
Yes, thank you. I understand that for many languages that's the case, but not for all languages. Look, I've been in some odd circumstances myself where I've been actually in Mexico. This happened to me once, where the common language between me and who I was talking to was Japanese, and so we spoke Japanese. The point I'm trying to make is I'm not sure how this gets implemented, and that should be a concern to us, and because not all languages actually have even Babel, Google Translate, or something like that available to them. So I'm just raising that point, and it's not that I object, because I think it makes it better. So I will withdraw an objection, because I think that actually makes the amendment better. I just don't know how you make the underlying amendment work.
so the point of order is withdrawn. The amendment to the amendment is unanimously adopted, and we will go on to the discussion of the amendment itself. The gentleman from Arizona had previously asked to be heard to strike the last word.
I move to strike the last word. And I speak in favor of the amendments offered by Congresswoman Jackson Lee and in favor of the underlying bill, H.R. 3239, Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in Customs and Border Protection Custody Act. I want to thank our friend, Congresswoman Escobar, for her leadership in organizing a great delegation of members that attended El Paso on July 1st and 2nd to tour the El Paso and Clinton Border Patrol facilities. And earlier this year, I had the opportunity to visit the Border Patrol station in Nogales, Arizona, where people were also being detained. I'll continue to reflect on these experiences while I do my job here in Congress. As Americans, we uphold certain values: equality, justice, and respect for the rule of law, freedom of speech, and I can tell you that those American values were not present in the facilities that I visited. Those facilities, regardless of whether they were for short-term or long-term, should have standards that reflect these values and always keep the well-being of the individual in mind. That is why I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of 3239. This bill proposes what individuals in detention should be receiving. They should be receiving health screenings upon arriving at a CBP facility. They should receive those screenings promptly. They should be provided with interpretation services during their screenings if they need them. They should have basics while in the detention, including clean drinking water, a working toilet, hand washing station, private and secure shower, soap, toothbrush, toothpaste, and feminine products. This is not an outrageous request. In fact, what is outrageous is that the CBP created its own minimum standards for how to treat people in detention, and even CBP has not been following their own standards as reported by DHS Officer of Inspector General just last month. This is exactly why we need this legislation today to become law. I'm committed to doing my part as a member of Congress from Arizona, a state that currently has several CBP and OR facilities, to ensure that DHS is responsible and accountable for how all individuals are treated while in the custody of the United States government. Our immigration policy simply can't be one designed to inflict as much pain on migrants as possible. That's unacceptable, it's un-American, it won't happen on our watch. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized as
Thank you,
strike
Madam
the last
Chairman.
word.
Thank you. I do think these proposals are coming from the right intention, but from a practical standpoint, sometimes we need to just step back and look at what we're doing. What's the effect of what we're doing? In the $4.6 billion package that was passed out of the House, none of it was for enforcement. None of it was for detention beds. None of it was for any of the things that are now being added on or proposed to be added on to the Border Patrol. These guys took an oath. They're supposed to enforce our laws, and yet they're not only running into people from Capitol Hill urging lawbreakers to resist the people that we pay to enforce the law, but also without giving any more money. When they're short of money, they don't have the personnel. The cages that were built by the Obama administration have not been expanded to where are improved as we might hope. They're not being given the money to do their jobs, and yet we still, it's a wonder they hadn't all had nervous breakdowns. We keep adding requirements onto them when they don't have the money to do what they're already doing. And I know there's some people out there saying, we keep adding requirements without the money to do it. There are forces at work trying to break the system. I know there are people here that are more concerned about the individuals, but you got to look at what we're doing here. No money. They don't have enough to take care of the people that are there, and yet the encouragement that we're not going to secure our border, we're going to get to an amnesty, we're going to get to legalization, keep coming from all over the world. And, it is a problem. And especially the idea of posting or in some manner making information available in indigenous languages, that's going to cost a bunch of money figuring all this out. I mean, you got Wycliffe trying to interpret the Bible in different languages all over the world, and they can't get it all done in a timely fashion. It costs a fortune. So my concern is, we say we're concerned about the personal welfare of the individuals that are breaking our laws and being detained, and yet we keep adding requirements that will take away more money from the ability to do so. And I think everybody here on our committee has gotten used to the idea it's a good thing to have audio and videotape so that we know what's happened. So if there is a renegade law enforcement officer that is not acting appropriately, we got it right there. That is true everywhere except one place that I know of, and that's our Federal Bureau of Investigation. And as we've looked into the Mueller report, we're going to have a hearing next week with Mr. Mueller himself. I continue to be amazed that what was considered at one time the preeminent law enforcement force in the country is the only one I know of. They don't want videotapes. They don't want audio tapes. All they want is the ability not to allow anybody to have audio or video tapes, and then they will write up what we call a 302, that memorializing a conversation and answers to questions, and so that when it comes to a trial or hearing, you've got people from this great law enforcement entity, the FBI, and an accused criminal. So my friend's amendment here brings back to mind, I hope that we could work across the aisle easily and push for video and audio recordings so we know what defendants and potential accused have said, and we're not forced to take just the word of an FBI agent. But that's the reason they hadn't gotten rid of 302s. They get to be the ultimate source on what somebody said. And so I appreciate very much the effort to memorialize these things, and I hope we'll expand it to the FBI after this. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I do strike the last word, and let me first and foremost say that I support the Jackson-Lee amendments. In 2018, there were 9 migrant deaths that occurred during encountering Customs and Border Patrol, including 7-year-old Jacqueline, who died of dehydration and shock, and 8-year-old Felipe, who died from the flu while in CBP custody. In the first half of 2019, there were 10 deaths, including a 2-year-old who died from pneumonia and 16-year-old Carlos, who died from the flu. H.R. 3239 raises the bar on humanitarian standards at our southern border. As I have mentioned in previous hearings, I have been to refugee camps in South Sudan, in Uganda, and parents and family members are never separated from their children. But unfortunately, we don't have to look beyond our own front door to know what's the right thing to do. You wouldn't stand for poor treatment of your children, grandchildren, or family members. Your children and grandchildren need your loving arms to protect them from harm, to look out for their health, and to ensure they have what they need to grow into happy, healthy adults. Your children need you. Migrant children need their parents and family members too. Migrant children need to feel the familial heartbeat, smells, and voices that assure them that they are going to be okay. But we already know from our own experiences, migrant children are fleeing with their families, escaping interpersonal and state violence. Migrant children need protection from harm. They need the people who know how and have the resources to soothe and care for them. Your children and grandchildren need pediatric health assessments and appropriate medical attention. So do migrant children. Your child's pediatrician needs the equipment and medication for assessment, triage, and treatment. So do the health providers for migrant children. You wouldn't leave your child sitting in soiled diapers, and you wouldn't change your child on a filthy surface. Migrant children deserve the same care for their hygiene and health. You make sure your children and grandchildren have nutritious food that allows them to be energetic, happy, and healthy. You wouldn't allow your children or grandchildren's safety, nutrition, health, and hygiene needs to go unmet, because you know that that can lead to illness and deaths, like the deaths of at least 7 children who died after being detained at the border. We must dig the bar out of the ground for the humane and dignified treatment of migrants and raise it up to minimum international standards. Someone's loved one's life is at stake. I now yield my time to Representative Jackson-Lee.
I thank the gentlelady, and I join her in, I will yield to you, Hank, if she's yielded to me. So let me just make just a few comments. I thank the gentlelady for her commitment to this whole issue, and I also thank her for support of the Jackson-Lee amendments. I just clearly want to say that who would doubt that we need this bill by Dr. Ruiz, and I thank him so very much, the Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in Customs and Border Protection Custody Act. I thank the gentleman on the other side of the aisle, my good friend, for removing his objection. But I do think that we're now in the 21st century, and I believe, having served on Homeland Security now for almost going into 2 decades, the Department of Homeland Security, which is one of the largest agencies that we have, knowing the process of management in that office, I believe that there is the wherewithal and the tools that we're giving both in Judiciary and in Homeland Security, that the idea of Bill of Rights with the relevant indigenous language and other languages and the video to protect all parties is clearly going to be an added asset. I close by saying with new technology, you can draw down languages, and there are a finite number of languages, in particular in the larger populations, that at this point in the surge that's coming across the border will be able to be managed by the Department of Homeland Security. So I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee amendment. I yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I rise in support of the Jackson-Lee amendment, the Detainee Bill of Rights. It's in keeping with our values, and our values are represented by the United States flag, which one of my colleagues mentioned had been vandalized, taken down, and replaced in our country with another flag, with another country's flag. I don't support that, but I will say that we have not been living up to the values that our flag exemplifies for years now. It is said that red represents the blood shed for liberty, white for equality, and blue for fraternity and brotherhood. Those are the values espoused by those colors, and we've not been living up to our true colors as a nation. And with that, I will yield back.
The gentlelady's time expires. Does anyone else wish to be heard? Gentleman.
North Dakota, move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I don't necessarily disagree with the sentiment, and particularly from the video. A video doesn't do any good if it is not actually held for a period of time. My concern with this is, I mean, to get inherently pragmatic, is something that happens at all levels of government at all time. What's the remedy? We put something in place, but we're not even requiring the promulgation of rules. We're not, what is the enforcement? And I think that really, even when you have like employment bill of rights, there are actually remedies to what happens if you don't have that hanging in your workroom in your office. So my question is, what is the remedy?
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you asked a very, very important question. What I would argue is, what has the voices been saying across the nation? The Congress should do something. And I think what that means is that every committee has a component of oversight. I think the remedy is the congressional oversight in compliance with the laws that we passed and signed by the President of the United States. And that is in Homeland Security, and that is over here. And so we are today doing something collectively to deal with health standards and dealing with overall oversight of border conditions at Homeland Security right now as I speak. And so I would just simply say to you, it'll be the oversight that we will offer. We have a responsibility now to step it up. Now, these bills pass, we will have, with Congresswoman Loughran and her leadership, you can be assured that we will be steadfast in monitoring that. And so violations of laws that we have fit under the general framework of the oversight of the Department of Homeland Security. Failure to comply means that they're derelict of duty, and there are responses to that, which is the oversight of the United States Congress. I yield to the gentleman. I thank you for allowing me to.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, because I should have said, excluding congressional oversight, what is the remedy? Because I agree with that. Anything we pass, we have oversight over, but when you're doing very specific requirements, particularly when you're dealing with the language that is indigenous language, and now with the amendment we've adopted, and there's very specific requirements, and I've thought about this at government from county, state, federal level, so controversial issues, mundane issues, it's not that. It's just I have a very difficult time supporting anything that has this many specific requirements without at least having a rulemaking authority to actually describe what the remedy is if it is violated. So with that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield just briefly?
Yes, ma'am.
And I know you don't intend to suggest that the Department of Homeland Security would violate the laws that we pass here. And because the president takes an oath to see that the laws are faithfully executed, it's our expectation that the laws, if this were to become law, would be executed and by this department, just as any department would follow the law. And I thank you for yielding.
Yes, ma'am. Particularly with the second one's fairly specific. The first one, has some significant ambiguity to it, particularly with the amendment we've accepted. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Unless there's further debate, the question is on the amendment. Those who are, as amended, those who are in favor will say aye. Aye. Those who are opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there amendments? Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of the substitute? Mr. Buck has asked for a recorded vote on the Jackson-Lee amendments, and so we will have a recorded vote.
Mr. Nadler? Ms. Loughran?
Aye.
Ms. Loughran votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Madam Chair, point of order. Which amendment are we voting on right now?
The two en banc amendments.
What if you wanted to vote for one and vote against the other?
Well, I think it's procedurally too late to make a request to divide the question unless, I think, right now there's one vote. I think we're too far in the proceedings to undo that, unfortunately. We could note in the record when you vote how your view, and we'll try and have that in the record.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stemmings? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Mucarsel-Powell? Ms. Mucarsel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko? Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stube? Mr. Stube votes no.
Clerk will the clerk will call the chairman's name.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye.
Gentleman from Georgia?
Mr. Collins votes no.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania. Gentleman from Florida? Any other members who wish to vote who haven't voted yet? The clerk will report the result.
Mr. Chairman, there are 18 ayes and 12 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Oh, the amendment is agreed to, I'm sorry. The amendment is agreed to. The amendments are agreed to. The two amendments are agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition? Colorado seek recognition?
We're way above Arizona, Mr. Chairman.
At least north of it, at least north of it.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. I just wanted to explain my vote. I agree with the gentlelady's amendment on the video monitoring equipment. I disagree with the gentlelady's amendment on the posting of the Bill of Rights including indigenous languages, because I think it would be unworkable. And so I voted no because I had to vote no on that second amendment involving the Bill of Rights. And I just wanted to clarify that. I appreciate the chair giving me that opportunity. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what
Mr. Chairman.
purpose does the gentleman from
Louisiana, strike last
Louisiana
word.
seek recognition?
I want to echo the comments of Mr. Bach. I agree that the video proposal was a good one, but the posting of the languages is unworkable to me, so I voted no for the same reason. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does a gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also just want to say I was hoping that those would have been divided. I probably should have been, I probably was asleep at the wheel. I should have made the motion, and so I apologize for that. But I do agree with the proposal regarding the video, retention of video records. I think that's very important. I do think the other, as I mentioned in my earlier statement, I think that's really unworkable, and so I would have voted yes on the video and no on the other, but I yield back.
For what purpose does a gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3239, offered by Mr. Stubbe of Florida.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is simple. First, it states that when the DHS Secretary makes a required report on plans for implementation under H.R. 3239, the Secretary also report the costs of implementation. And second, it delays the 6-month implementation requirement if Congress doesn't actually appropriate sufficient funds to carry out the requirements of this expensive bill. The requirements that H.R. 3239 would impose on CBP facilities are immensely burdensome and would create an unfunded mandate. Clearly, CBP was not consulted as to the feasibility or time frame for implementing this bill. That is clear because the bill itself requires DHS to report to Congress after 60 days the, quote, challenges of implementing its requirements. This is no way to legislate. We should worry about the feasibility now, not after we pass something that simply won't work. That is why this amendment would delay implementation unless Congress actually appropriates sufficient funds for CBP to meet the requirements of this bill. Under H.R. 3239, CBP will have to obtain, through hiring or contracting, numerous additional medical professionals and make updates to facilities to accommodate those professionals in their required activities. And it's not simply licensed medical professionals necessary to conduct comprehensive initial medical screenings. This bill directs CBP to have on-site, to the extent practical, at all CBP facilities where individuals are brought after apprehension, quote, licensed emergency care professionals, specialty physicians, including physicians specializing in pediatrics, family medicine, obstetrics, and gynecology, geriatric medicine, internal medicine, and infectious diseases, nurse practitioners, other nurses, physician's assistants, licensed social workers, mental health professionals, public health professionals, dietitians, interpreters, and chaperones. Let me just draw a parallel for you for a second. I represent a district that has a number of different VA facilities in them. At none of the VA facilities in my district are there any specialty physicians. So we're actually going to provide in this bill better health care to illegal immigrants breaking our laws than veterans who have served our country and are over 30% service-connected disabled who swore an oath to support and defend our Constitution. Let me let that sink in for you for a second. If somebody in my district goes to a VA medical facility, they have to get a referral to another facility for a specialty physicians because they're not at all the clinics. They have to go to a hospital for that. And that could take anywhere between 60 and 90 days based on the Mission Act that passed Congress last Congress. The time requirements in this bill for these specialty physicians is 12 hours after detainee's arrival at a CBP facility, but not later than 6 hours after detainee's arrival if it's a high priority individual. Furthermore, if they have psychiatric issues, on page 6 of the bill, that is required as well within those timeframes. Veterans are having to wait 60 to 90 days to get the type of treatment that they deserve. We have 35 veterans just last year that committed suicide in a veteran-approved licensed facility. We have 21 veterans a day that are committing suicide because they have to wait 60 to 90 days to get treatment. And so we're gonna allow legal immigrants only 6 hours to 12 hours to get specialty physicians. The requirements of H.R. 3239 applies across all CBP facilities, not just Border Patrol stations. CBP would have to implement the requirements at ports of entry, including ports on the land borders, but also seaports, airports, checkpoints, and forward operating bases operating in remote areas. CBP would also have to retrofit or build out new buildings at many facilities in order to meet the extensive requirements of this bill. Clearly, the cost of implementation will be extremely high, yet H.R. 3239 does not even authorize additional funds. How is the DHS to implement H.R. 3239 within 6 months? It's simply unrealistic. Therefore, I propose this amendment to ensure that DHS is only required to implement this bill within 6 months, provided that Congress has funded its implementation. I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment to ensure that we are not creating an unfunded mandate that will simply be used to malign the men and women of CBP on the front lines of meeting a true crisis. If my colleagues are content to pass a mere messaging bill that doesn't even authorize funding for its mandates, they should vote against this amendment. But if they are serious that these onerous and burdensome requirements actually be implemented by DHS, the least they can do is pay for it. That is the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady does not insist on a point of order. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. We have a crisis. Children are dying. People are being tortured. The amendment, in essence, says that we should continue child abuse and should continue torture indefinitely until Congress comes up with other funds, because we have to continue torturing and killing children lest it be an unfunded mandate. It's offensive. Second of all, Congress just finished passing $4.5 billion, which can be used for this purpose. This bill will cost nothing like $4.5 billion, but a small fraction of it, and it should have been done previously already. The gentleman mentions that construction has to occur. The gentlelady from California, the chairwoman of the committee, of the subcommittee, pointed out that during the Obama administration, 2014, a facility was constructed in 10 days. If we want to stop torturing the children and the adults, we can do so. The funds have already been appropriated. We ought to do so. And the fact the gentleman alleges that veterans are getting poor medical care, well, then we ought to change that. If veterans are not getting proper medical care, we ought to give them proper medical care. But it is not a license to torture children and other people at the border. Second of all, the gentleman says that these people are illegal aliens. Some of them are. Some of them will not get political asylum. Some of them will. These people are mostly applicants for political asylum. A lot of them will get political asylum. They're entitled to political asylum under our law. They're not illegal aliens. The fact that the administration, by refusing people entry at ports of entry, is forcing people to cross the border illegally, does not say that they should not have been admitted legally, if not for the illegal policy of the administration in refusing asylum applicants entry at the legal border crossing point, forcing them to cross not at an entry point. And many of those people who cross not at an entry point have perfectly valid legal claims for asylum, and upon adjudication will get asylum. The fact that we don't have enough resources, we haven't provided enough resources for enough immigration judges and for other procedures to speed it up, is not their fault. And we should not torture people and children at the border, period. It's a disgrace in our country that we've been doing so, and we ought to stop it. This bill will at least provide for proper medical evaluation and screening and treatment right away. It will stop kids from dying at the border. It's the least we can do, and it's not an unfunded mandate. We just passed $4.5 billion, which can be used for this, and if it were an unfunded mandate, so what?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yield.
The gentlelady from California.
On the point, if I may, and I thank the gentleman for yielding, I think the gentleman from Florida has misread the proposal, and I do think it's important to clarify. There is, in the bill, an initial health screening that takes about 5 minutes. If in that screening there is an indication of a problem that requires follow-up care, the care should be followed up, but you don't have to hire these people. It can be a video assessment, it could be a telephone call. If somebody's had a heart attack, you don't have to have a cardiologist in every Border Patrol station. You call the hospital to get the care. So it's not in the bill that you have to hire all these people. You have to have the ability for follow-on care in the community, and it would be unreasonable to expect all of these specialty care physicians to be in every Border Patrol station. That's impossible, and it's not in the bill. And I thought it would be important to clarify that, and I thank the chairman for yielding.
the chairman
I yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I associate myself with your remarks, but I want to make one point. I take Mr. Stubbe at his word that he is intended for a good purpose, but this is a really problematic amendment because you essentially would have Congress pass laws and then have an agency decide whether they determine sufficient funds have been appropriated. That just can't be. We're responsible. If we don't appropriate enough money, we're responsible for that. But how would an agency, who would decide what is, quote, sufficient funds to carry out the requirements? You would have bureaucrats within the agency saying, we don't think you've given us enough. That's not on them, that's on us. And so we have the responsibility of passing laws, which this legislation does, and then we ought to work together to make sure we continue to appropriate money. But it would be a very dangerous practice if we let agencies of the executive branch decide on their own whether or not they've concluded they've gotten enough money to follow the law. That turns our democracy on its head. I know you don't intend that, but I urge folks to consider that and vote against the amendment. Thank you.
My time has expired. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? The gentlelady, for what purpose? The gentlelady from Texas.
Move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I too am opposed to this amendment, and certainly you have outlined the reasons that this bill is necessary because this is a humanitarian crisis at the border. We know that the systematic human rights abuses are occurring. We know that adults and children both are being kept in overcrowded facilities, are hungry, neglected, and most importantly, some of them are being exposed to some environmental issues that would create even more health hazards. However, I don't think, I cannot agree with him that this isn't a funded mandate. Just as you pointed out, there's been ample supplementals already appropriated to address many of these issues, but it's the policies and the choices that are being made by this administration in implementing that are making these issues even worse. And to his remarks about veterans, I totally agree with him. We should be doing more for veterans, particularly in healthcare, particularly in VA hospitals everywhere, including in Houston. But I think what's even more horrifying is that veterans are being deported. I think that's a real issue. So for me, I am against this amendment. I am for this bill. I'm a co-sponsor, and I think that our American values, our conscience, our Constitution, our humanity demands that we pass this bill and oppose this amendment.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I would.
Thank you. I thank my colleague, Representative Garcia, for reminding us of what's important to think about as we reject this amendment. There's something else that I would like for us to think about in evaluating this amendment. It's not just children and families in our custody who are getting sick, but we have Border Patrol agents who are also getting sick. And they're getting sick because we have not improved the standards for these facilities. And so I just spoke with some folks representing the Border Patrol. We had this very conversation. I've spoken with agents throughout my district in the El Paso sector who are worried about the conditions in their stations. This is absolutely about migrants in our care. It is also absolutely about Border Patrol agents employed by our government. And so I would urge my colleagues to reject this amendment. And I would like to make just one last point. Family separation has come with a terrible financial cost as well as a terrible moral cost. I don't remember anybody who supported family separation asking for a cost estimate before it was implemented. The Migrant Protection Protocol program, not just a moral cost, there's a financial cost. These are policies implemented by an administration that wants to deter migrants And that is costing our government money. And I would like to see the same kind of emphasis placed on accountability over those terrible policies, the same kind of emphasis on that I see being placed on trying to create standards that provide better health care and an environment for agents and migrants. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? The gentleman from
North Dakota.
For what purpose do you seek recognition?
I seek recognition to yield time to my colleague from Florida.
Move to strike the last word.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Yield to Mr. Stubbe.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to respond to the contention that I didn't read the bill correctly. If you look at page 8, and I'll just read line 22 through 24, all of those listed physicians that I elicitated in my remarks shall be located on site to the extent practicable, or if not practicable, shall be available on call. Now, I've only been a lawyer for 15 years, but shall means shall, and on call to me means on call in the sense that they have to be there within a certain period of time, those timeframes that are provided for in the bill previously. Those are such as, starting at line 15, licensed emergency care professionals, specialty physicians, including physicians that specialize in pediatrics, family medicine, obstetrics, gynecology, geriatric medicine, internal medicine, and infectious disease, nurse practitioners, other nurses, physician's assistants, licensed social workers, mental health professionals, public health professionals, dietitians, interpreters, and chaperones shall be located on site to the extent practicable, or if not practicable, shall be available on call. I wish that any of the veteran clinics that I have in my district had any of these people either located on site or on call. In my district, you have to drive about 2.5 to 4 hours to Bay Pines to get any of these listed physician specialties. Because none of them are available to any of the veterans in my district. So we are going to treat illegal immigrants who come to our country with better health care than is available in my district in 9 counties in the state of Florida to veterans who have served our country, who have raised their right hand and sworn oath to our Constitution, who have served in combat, who are more than 30% service-connected disabled, and have the ability to get VA care.
The gentleman yield?
No, I will not yield. I have 3 minutes.
Clarification?
He's not yielding.
For edification?
This is my time, and I am speaking.
Would the gentleman just yield for 1 second?
No. I'll yield when I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Stubbe.
Gentleman controls the time.
Anybody else? Just waiting, because I've got 2:40.
The gentleman may proceed. His time is running.
I know it's running, and you've interrupted me 4 times now. So as I was saying, we are going to provide all of these special health care providers to every single CBP location in the entire United States to illegal immigrants who are illegally coming into our country, yet we are not going to provide the same level of health care to veterans who have served our country. I would think that general Americans, most Americans, regardless of your political affiliation, would have a little bit of a problem with that. Not to mention the basis of this amendment, how much is this going to cost? How much is this going to cost for CBP to be able to implement this bill? Because I know the Veterans Affairs budget from 2016 to today has gone up by $100 billion, and they can't even provide specialty providers at the clinics located, at least in my district. Now, I can't speak for everybody's district, but in my district. So I think most Americans would be very troubled by the fact that we are going to provide health care with all of these specialties and psychiatric care. 21 veterans a day are committing suicide. 35 veterans committed suicide last year in our veteran clinics. Veterans in my district have told me that they have called Veterans Affairs for psychiatric treatment, which this bill requires you to do it within 6 hours to 12 hours upon a detainee getting into a facility, and have to wait right now. And you can go to the oversight committee that I spoke exactly on this issue 2 weeks ago. Veterans are on a waiting list for psychiatric treatment at Bay Pines Hospital, 60 to 90 days to get the psychiatric care that they deserve. 60 to 90 days. These are veterans who have reached out to the VA saying they have psychiatric problems and they need help. They have to wait 60 to 90 days. Well, if you're an illegal immigrant, you can just come to any CBP facility and you can get psychological treatment within 12 hours or within 6 hours. How is that? I can't see a single American in our country, regardless of your political affiliation, that thinks that is appropriate care to give to our veterans and compared to the type of care that the Democratic majority wants to give to our illegal immigrants who are illegally crossing into our country. And with that, I yield back to the chair.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady from California is recognized.
I assume the goodwill of all of my colleagues and that the gentleman from Florida believes what he has just said. However, I think it's important that we clarify that it is incorrect. The bill as written and clarified by the manager's amendment really goes an initial health screening that takes about 5 minutes, basically to determine whether the person is in physical distress. If there is a need for follow-on medical care, that should be provided, and that can be a phone call under the bill. It could be a video. If you've got a kid covered with a rash, you could take a photograph of that rash and email it to a doctor, and that would comply with this section of the bill to see whether it's a contagious disease or not. If you're having a heart attack, you don't have to have a heart doctor at every station. You have to have the ability to call a hospital to find out what to do or to call an ambulance. I would hope, hearing about the remote nature of some of the gentlemen from Florida's constituents, that if those veterans are having a heart attack, that they can call somebody and get an ambulance to come take them and take care of them. I would hope that that would be the case. And if it's not the case, I would be happy to work with the gentleman to make sure that it is the case, because all Americans deserve a minimum level of medical care so that they can have a happy life. It is not the case that this bill provides a higher level of medical care to asylees than is provided to veterans. It's simply not the case. And I want to make sure that that message does not go out. We have had 7 children die in our custody in the last few years. That's really an appalling number. In the last 10 years, we didn't have any children die in our custody. We need to do a better job of making sure that more children don't die in our custody. And I know that all of us agree on that. We don't want babies to die in a cell because they've been neglected. That has happened. And so, it doesn't mean that we have a pediatrician in every CBP office, but if you've got an infant that's in distress, you have to have the capacity to call and get some attention for that child. And that is not happening right now. That's not happening. So we really actually shouldn't even have to do this bill. A lot of this is common sense, but the Border Patrol agents have been overwhelmed by the numbers, and I think that overwhelming has been a mandate. I don't blame the CBP officers. I think they're, for the most part, good people and trying to do their best. It's a management decision that has caused this problem, where we've piled people up on these Border Patrol stations while there's space in the ICE detention facilities, there's space in the ORR facilities, and the department declined to do what was obvious and has been done in the past, to create excess capacity, which you can do in under 2 weeks. So, we need to intervene as a Congress on this situation, because we don't want the deaths of these children on our hands. None of us do, whether we agree or disagree on overall issues of asylum law or the like. 100% of us don't want children to die in CBP custody. So I think it's important that we clarify this. This is not a requirement for fully staffed clinics at CBP offices. It is a requirement that you make a phone call if somebody's in distress, that if somebody's having a heart attack, you call an ambulance, that you do some initial screening to find out whether people are in trouble or not. And we have had reports and members who've personally seen newborns in these cells, which is the last place in the world a brand new baby ought to be. So I recognize the concern the gentleman has expressed about veterans. I'm not on the Veterans Affairs Committee, obviously, but I would hope if the situation is as dire for the vets in his district, that we could work together across the aisle to improve that situation. This bill has nothing to do with that, and I yield back.
I have a point of order.
The point of order would be, sir?
You just took care of it. I was asking whether the chair had been abandoned, but I assume that it has not now, so thank you.
And the time has expired. Does any other member wish to be heard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to my colleague, Mr. Biggs.
Mr. Biggs is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make a couple comments about the amendment that we're dealing with today. When I look at the language and I read this, and we talk about we're talking about people, the location to which detainees are first transported after an initial encounter with an agent or officer of CBP. Now, I want you to understand what this may mean. That some of these territories are vast. I mean, literally, you have the Sassabee Station comes to my mind, the Antelope Well Station in Arizona. These are ports of entry that are, any other person would say, these are just really so far removed and remote. And so and it says that they're going to provide the initial medical intake. That seems to be fine. I don't think anybody has any problem with that. But the onerous part comes here when it says appropriate transportation to medical facilities in the case of a medical emergency. On page 8, this is of the ANS. In case of a medical emergency or an on-call service with the ability to arrive at the CBP facility within 30 minutes. That's necessary. You have to have the ability to arrive within 30 minutes. So I appreciate what the chairwoman said when she said that you can have some video conferencing and whatnot, but this requires the ability to arrive at the CBP facility within 30 minutes. Now, the reason that this is important is because in the gentleman's amendment, he referenced page 8, and in his concern there, if you look in lines 22 through 24, it says, these people shall be located on site to the extent practicable. And I think all of us would say there's really no way that that it's practicable for all these people to be there. Or if not practicable, shall be available on call. Well, we've just defined what on call is on lines 5 through 8 of page 8. And that's really to be able to arrive in 30 minutes. That makes this aspect of this virtually unworkable, at least in the great Southwest of Arizona, where some of these facilities that individuals first encounter are really, really remote. You have to realize it might take for backup, you will have a single CBP agent out there, and there's no radio communication for that individual to make to someone else. If they need backup, it might take 2.5, 3 hours to get backup. And they're going to put somebody in a facility, and this bill would say, you better have the capacity to get somebody there on call within 30 minutes. We haven't defined on call to mean some kind of video circumstance, and that's the problem I see with this. I think that the gentleman's amendment is well taken, and with that, I'm going to yield back to Mr. Reschenthaler his time, so I'll yield back to Mr. Reschenthaler.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Just for clarification purposes, on line 8, in the case of a medical emergency, and a heart attack in a remote area, and this would be at a forward station, which you're describing, and that are in remote areas, there are air ambulances that will come not only for someone having a heart attack at a forward station, I would hope, whether it's a Border Patrol agent, whether it's a detainee, or whether it's a farmer next door, if you're having a heart attack, we're going to want to get an air ambulance in there. That's distinct from further down the page, which is not limited to medical emergencies, shall be available on call. And on call can be a telephone call, it could be a visit. The two are not linked.
reclaim.
Ma'am, I'd like to yield more
And
time.
I yield
Mr.
back to the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Reschenthaler. I'll say this. The problem that you have with that explanation is that on line 6, medical emergency is set apart distinctly from any kind of on-call service with the ability to arrive at the CBP facility within 30 minutes. It actually defeats the very thing you just talked about. So, having taken helicopters from one facility to another, I can tell you there are facilities in Arizona that you cannot get there with a helicopter to air evac somebody in less than 45 minutes to an hour, sometimes 2 hours, and get them to a facility. That's a problem that you have here because you, on line 6 through 8, after the word "or," you've really defined what on-call means, and that means to be within, be able to get there in 30 minutes. That's the problem that I see with this bill, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
And the gentleman's time has expired. Unless there are further discussion, the question will come on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. And all those opposed will say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes prevailed.
I ask for a roll call vote.
A roll call will be called by the clerk.
Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton? No. Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Mucarsel-Powell?
No.
Ms. Mucarsel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomer? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Buck votes yes. Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Ms. Lesko? Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes yes.
Are there other members? Mr. Jordan?
Mr. Jordan votes yes.
Mr. Cohen?
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Mr. Correa?
Mr. Correa votes no.
Are there other members who wish to vote or to change their votes? If not, then the clerk will report.
Madam Chair, there are 9 ayes and 17 noes.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Madam Chair,
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order, and the clerk will distribute the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3239, offered by Mr. Gates of Florida.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I am so encouraged that earlier in this hearing, Chairman Nadler, on behalf of all members on the committee, indicated that you stand with the proposition of a maintained CBP entity within our government, and that you stand against the position of the squad, which has been repeatedly identified as seeking to abolish the Department of Homeland Security, CBP, and ICE. So thank you so much for standing with the good people of CBP, that they need to be able to continue to exist and do their important work. Thank you for speaking out against the squad, and I truly appreciate the chairman, in response to my prior amendment, indicating that every member of the Judiciary Committee on the majority side would oppose the abolition of CBP, and that is merely the view of the squad. This amendment I think builds on that opportunity for consensus by expressing that the sense of Congress is that the legislation requires additional resources for CBP to engage in the activities that the majority seeks to delineate in the bill, and thus, in order to ensure that CBP is able to execute on what the majority seeks, it is merely the sense of Congress that there is supplemental appropriation necessary. I would caution my majority members, please don't fall into the trap that your own whip, Mr. Clyburn, fell into by not recognizing the need for supplemental appropriation. I'll remind you again that it was January 9th of this very year where Mr. Clyburn was asked whether or not there was a humanitarian crisis on the border. And his response was jovial laughter and then the assertion that there absolutely was not a crisis. It is my expectation that because you refuse to fix our asylum laws, you refuse to enhance physical structures and barriers on the border, you refuse to engage in solving the root problems of this mass movement of people illegally frequently into our country, that at least you would join us in expressing the sense of Congress that CBP would require supplemental funding. It is my prediction that months from now, we will still be in the same place. We will still have tens of thousands of people every few weeks that are illegally entering our country. And so please don't vote against this and then later come back and say that it was really Democrats all along that understood the crisis and that understood the need for this important supplemental funding for CBP. The folks at CBP, I've spent time with them. I've gone to the border. I know many of my colleagues in the majority and in the minority have done the same. They are truly besieged with a crisis that they are not equipped to handle. And I appreciate that while I disagree with some of the assumptions in the underlying legislation, at least the majority is working to try to acknowledge the crisis. At least the majority isn't taking the same position that Mr. Clyburn took, which is laughing at the notion of a crisis, but acknowledging it is not enough. We actually have to ensure that we have the resources available. And so this will be a moment in time. Did you agree that we need to continue to fund CBP, or is there going to be regression from the standard that the chairman expressed earlier, and are you going to regress more to the positions of the squad in demonizing the great people who work at Homeland Security, ICE, and Border Patrol? Join us, stand with them, and recognize the need for additional funding to deal with this crisis, or face the extreme high likelihood that you will have to be fed back your own words and your own actions yet again in this committee, as my good friend, my colleague from the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, said were psychological operations at our last committee hearing, because we simply wanted to refresh the words of the majority's own leadership to them. I hope you'll join me in the amendment.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
I don't underestimate the gentleman's passion for his commitment, as we all have on this side of the aisle, for the right kind of care at the border and the right kind of funding. I will remind the gentleman that we just appropriated $4.6 billion. That is added on to the normal appropriations for DHS. But let me, as a friend, take issue with the fact of mention of members who are not in this room. I take issue with the laughter alleged by Whip Clyburn. I don't have
I'm
any.
going to reclaim my
I don't have any
time for my
facts,
remaining few
and
seconds.
take issue.
I'm sorry, madam. I'm sorry. I
with
control
the
the time.
use of the word
I control the
quad.
time.
I don't know
I
what
would like
the
my
word
time
quad
restored
means.
because I
I
control
yield
the
back to
time.
the gentleman.
Thank
It
you.
is the gentleman's time, and he has 5 seconds restored.
It was not an allegation of laughter. It was playing the gentleman's own laughter. And so, like, you guys can't laugh at our claims of a crisis, and then when you're fed back the laughter,
Gentleman's time
assert
has
that it wasn't
expired.
laughter.
The gentleman's time has
belies logic. I yield back.
The gentleman's, and I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. I hope that we can have, I mean, obviously, members can say what they wish, but we did have a very robust discussion about funding and this bill in the last amendment, and hopefully we might not have to duplicate that. I would note that the sense of Congress actually provides no force of law. As the gentlelady from Texas has just pointed out, we have just allocated an additional over $4.5 billion in the supplemental appropriations. We are working right now in the Appropriations Committee on the appropriations for next fiscal year, and I'm sure that our colleagues on both sides of the aisle will do an excellent job in fomenting that appropriations bill. So unless there are further comments on this amendment, we may vote on it. Seeing none, all those in favor of the amendment will say aye. All those opposed will say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam Chair, I request a recorded vote.
And the gentleman has requested a recorded vote, and the clerk will call a recorded vote.
Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. McCarcel-Powell? Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Nadler? Mr.
How are we voting on this? No.
Mr. Nadler votes no.
Anyone else? Are there any other members who wish to be recorded or haven't been recorded? Has Mr. Neguse been recorded? The clerk will announce the result.
Mr. Chairman, there are 9 ayes and 17 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3239, offered by Mr. Gates of Florida.
The does the gentlelady insist on a point of order? No, wait a minute. The gentleman will explain. Was recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like the amendment read.
We've already had unanimous consent not to read the
I
amendment.
don't recall that unanimous consent.
Without objection,
I
the
object.
clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3239, offered by Mr. Gates of Florida. On page 1, after line 6, add the following. Section 15, Sense of Congress. On page 17, after line 9, add the following. Section 15, Sense of Congress. Whereas over 6 million souls perished in the Holocaust, and whereas the Nazi death camps were autocracies unparalleled in human history, and we must never forget this monstrous evil end, whereas the
Mr.
choice
Chairman,
to come to America.
Mr. Chairman,
The clerk will suspend. For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
having had the chance now to review this, I do insist on my point of order.
You will state your point of order.
Point of order is that this amendment is not germane to the underlying bill. It relates to ICE detention facilities as well as foreign policy and historical items that are unrelated to the underlying bill and is beyond the scope of the bill.
The gentleman is recognized to be heard on the point of order only.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the point, the underlying legislation speaks to the operations and activities of the Custom and Border Patrol, and it would seem entirely germane to express the sense of Congress that the people that would be carrying out the humanitarian assistance and would be transferring vulnerable people into the care of medical professionals are not associated with Nazis or concentration camps or death camps. That would seem inherent in the review and the reflections of the Congress on the underlying bill, and it would seem inappropriate to move legislation forward on the utility of the Custom and Border Patrol and their operations in the absence of expressing our clear viewpoint that they are not running concentration camps, that there is no valid comparison to the tropes of Nazi Germany. And to speak further to the point, I would yield to my colleague from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
The gentleman is not permitted to yield. He was recognized only for the point, only for the purpose of debating the point of order, and for only that purpose.
Point of parliamentary inquiry?
Has the gentleman finished?
I have a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his inquiry.
Mr. Chairman, would it be parliamentary appropriate to yield to another member for the purpose of speaking to the point?
No, he has to get his own time.
No, it is not.
Very well. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I am prepared to rule on the point. The chair is prepared to rule on the point of order. The point of order is well taken. This amendment is way out of the scope of the bill. The amendment deals with a different subject matter and purpose. The amendment deals with a different subject matter and purpose and would broaden the measure beyond the current scope. The bill deals with medical facilities and personnel availability being supplied to certain people under detention. The amendment deals with a different subject matter entirely. The amendment is therefore out of order.
Point of order.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek?
I have a point of order.
The gentleman will state his point of order.
Thank you. My point of order is the motion on the germaneness issue put forward by the representative from California was premature.
The point of order.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, your point of order. Exactly. It was premature in the sense that we had not completed reading the amendment, and normally, what the process normally is to bring the amendment forward, take it by unanimous consent, and then those types of amendments, or excuse me, objections go forward. I would assert that that was premature.
I don't know if that was made as a point of order or not, but I'll rule against it if it's a point of order. Well, I'll rule against it if it's a point of order on the grounds that the objection was timely made and did not have to wait. It was timely made. The amendment is out of order. We're prepared. Are there any other amendments? Then the question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a
The Chair, I move to strike the last word on the bill, underlying bill.
on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
On the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Gentleman gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Chair, and I want the Chair to know that I approach this matter delicately, but I think it's necessary to approach the matter and to discuss this issue. Last week, the Chair referred to United States government personnel as having committed negligent homicide. This week, the Chair, in this hearing, the Chair referred to United States government personnel as having committed torture. There was a time, not too long ago, before I was in Congress, I believe the Chair was in Congress at the time, where the administration made a decision on enhanced interrogation techniques, ran that decision by the U.S. Department of Justice, got a legal opinion on it, and conducted certain interrogation techniques that some thought were torture and some thought were enhanced interrogation techniques. That was a legitimate discussion. It was not something that was thrown out frivolously. It was something that concerned the integrity of this country and our values. What the Chair has done in this hearing, the Chair has accused United States government personnel of having violated international law, of purposefully engaged in torture, purposefully engaged in the, and again, the previous discussion was involving trying to obtain information to save American lives. There has been no such allegation here. I think that when you look around this room and you see the portraits of the individuals that have served as chair of the Judiciary Committee, it demeans the position of chair to make allegations, unfounded allegations like that, allegations where there is no credible evidence of intent to commit the crimes that the chair is identifying. And I would ask the chair to clarify his remarks so that we don't have on the record allegations like that. I have been in 2 or 3 hearings now with the chair of the Immigration Subcommittee. We have heard about the concerning conditions that exist because of overcrowding. We may disagree about the causes of those conditions, but we have heard about those conditions. Not once did the chair of the subcommittee, not once did she allege that there was negligent homicide. Not once did she allege that there was torture. We all agreed in the committee that we would not want to see these conditions in America, that we would not want to see migrants or anybody else held in the kinds of conditions that existed. We disagreed about some of the reasons for those conditions. But to use the word torture, to use the word negligent homicide, I think is above what the facts present to us. And as I said, I think it demeans the position of chair. And I ask the gentleman to clarify his remarks. And I yield to the gentleman from Florida at this time.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I associate myself with his comments. And I think what highlights the absurdity of the positions taken by the majority in this hearing is that the majority has functionally said if we do not pass this bill, then children will be subject to torture. And what the bill provides are government-sponsored dietitians. Now, I think most Americans would agree that there is a vast delta between being tortured and having a government-paid-for dietitian. We probably got people in my district who would take a government-sponsored dietitian. Heck, I might need one myself. There might be a few other folks around here that would benefit from a government-sponsored dietitian, but I don't think that reflecting on the conditions in these circumstances as torture and then saying that the antidote are all of these entitlements that are provided in the bill is appropriate for the committee. And I yield back.
And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I will take a point of personal privilege to reply. I did not intent on the part to imply intent on the part of CBP officials, perhaps on the part of the Trump administration, but I think that the conditions we've seen, the conditions that have been documented, the conditions that have been denied by the administration, by the Vice President, are indeed torture. We've seen children die. We haven't seen a child die in custody for many, many years, but we've seen 10 or 7 die in the last few months this year. I think that's negligent homicide. I do not take those comments back. I do not attribute to them to ill will, except perhaps on the part of the administration and the higher-ups. And I think the facts speak for themselves, and this is not the time to debate them. There are no further amendments. The question occurs on the amendment. The nature of a substitute is amendment.
Strike the last word.
The question occurs on the
Move
nature.
to strike the last word.
All right. The gentleman is recognized.
I was going to hold off here until your explanation. And again, I think the gentleman from Colorado was very forthright and then we continue on into not saying that they're not appropriate. And I think he made a very valid point that in the immigration subcommittee hearings, which have been, and the gentlelady has done, we've not had these inflammatory words. We need to solve this problem. I agree with you. It needs to be solved. But saying negligent, I mean, we're not even taking into account, when you say that, there's nothing on the other side. There's nothing to say that unfortunately, that some who have passed away came to the border and crossed over in very delicate medical situation to start with. I mean, and then given the best treatment that they could have at the time. I think the interesting issue here is that, Mr. Chairman, please understand, both sides want to try and solve this issue. What is amazing to me again today, and I stated in my opening statement, is this doesn't solve the underlying problem. We're putting a Band-Aid on the symptom, and yet we're using inflammatory language to make it seem worse and to make our side seem as if we don't care. Please take that into consideration when you make comments such as those, when you're implying the work of the officers who try to get up every day, who many, as I've talked to, who are struggling with this, whose marriages are falling apart because they're working 20 and 24 hours and 6 and 7 days a week. I feel for them just as much as I feel for the immigrants and migrants coming, but we're not solving the issue. And I think it was expressed on your side today very beautifully. We need to find a solution to this because we need to make sure that the incentives are not there to come across, but when they get here, treat them humanely. I'll get that. I subscribe to that and want to see that happen. Unfortunately, what this will do is not doing that. But also, Mr. Chairman, when we understand this, your language matters. And by saying negligent homicide, by saying the issue of torture, you're implying, and the implication is if we don't agree with you, then that's what we're doing. And that's just wrong, Mr. Chairman. And that's something we can talk about. It's something we can have a discussion about when we actually bring bills to this floor that actually go to the root of the problem at the border that has been expressed from the Obama administration through the Trump administration.
Would the gentleman yield?
And I'm not. Not right now. I appreciate it. But I want to try and find this situation. And we can have our differences in how we say it. We're just saying, and I think that's what the gentleman, the ranking member on the subcommittee for immigration is saying, is just being mindful of what we're saying. There can be any number of areas that we can be serious about this without having language that is simply inflammatory and doesn't help us get any closer to solving this problem. One last, as it was said before. Extraneous comments about the nature of our amendments and our discussions is not helpful. I may think that most do. We've had both times, and I remember in the previous Congress thinking that we all do things. We strike the last word. Mr. Raskin, we've been on this committee several years. We do strike the last word, and sometimes I may think it's a waste of time. You may think it's a waste of time, but that's our job. We get to do that. It's part of the rules. So inherently if you want to strike 5 minutes and then just say why it's a bad idea, that's fine. But just simply adding extraneous comments about it's a waste of time or anything like that is not helpful to the debate process. With this, I'm not sure who has it. Ms. Escobar, I'll be happy to yield to you.
Thank you. I would like for us to focus on, again, on the solutions, just as you said, Mr. Collins. The focusing on 4 women of color and repeatedly bringing up amendments and trying to incite stuff, that's not helpful either. Using language in this amendment saying that migrants can, quote, choose to go back to their home countries, sounds a lot like language we just talked about yesterday on the House floor in a resolution. Yes, words matter. Yes, we all want to do right by our agents, by the migrants. Let's focus on that, and let's encourage, if there are amendments, let's let the amendments focus on solutions, please.
Thank you. Thank you, and are you reclaiming my time? But I do think that the gentlelady would agree with me that nothing that we have brought forth in this committee this year under the immigration actually addresses the loopholes that have been discussed from the Obama administration through the Trump administration. And those are the kind of things that this may, in your opinion, and we can disagree on this bill, does help from your side. I'm not sure it does. But we're also not addressing the underlying problem. And I think the language that I spoke of, which transcends this hearing, is what needed to be discussed here. I appreciate your concern. We'll take that in, and I would love to have this discussion further in this hearing on actual markup. With that, I yield back.
Move to strike the last word.
Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you. I just want to make a few comments about the ANS that we're considering now. I do think it's problematic. I think that the intentions are important and they're good. I will tell you, I remember standing on the floor months ago, many months ago, after seeing the massive surge at the Yuma facility, where it was designed for 250 people to be held for no more than 12 hours. Short-term, it's not even a detention facility, it's a holding facility meant to process people. And as we went, I came back and said, these are inhumane conditions. I told the facility coordinator, the area chief, I told them all. They're inhumane. I don't think there's anybody here that doesn't say we've got a massive problem in some of these facilities. I do think that inflammatory language is not good, is not helpful, even though I understand the desire to vent on that. But I will say that people respond to incentives, and preserving incentives, which is what this bill does. It preserves and actually expands some incentives. It's going to actually increase the problem that we have in our facilities, and that's part of the problem that I have with this. I also believe that it will encourage human trafficking and provides massive loopholes for human traffickers to come in. That's a real problem. Now, I want to comment about somebody said the administration should have been ready for a seasonal surge. I want you to think about that. A seasonal surge is what this was called. Record numbers of apprehensions. Record number of apprehensions, called a seasonal surge, as if we had twice as many as normal. We didn't have twice as many as normal. You had 145,000 apprehensions in 1 month alone. 145,000. You have a 25,000 bed deficit in CBP and ICE facilities. That isn't a seasonal surge. That is a response to lack of interior enforcement and preservation of incentives which draw people to our country. That is what's critical here. And this bill will continue to do the same. We don't define who a family member is. We don't define what an adult relative is. And I'm looking at page 3 of the ANS. This is just one of many, and I pointed some out earlier times when I spoke. The medical professional shall review any prescribed medication that's in the detainee's possession or that was confiscated by CBP. Okay, that makes some sense to me. But who verifies the ID of the person? Who verifies and determines the correspondence between that individual and that prescription? We live in a society ourselves where we know prescription drugs are stolen and used and abused regularly. But now, effectively, what we're doing is we're putting a liability on CBP on people that we don't know who they are. They're destroying their identification documents as they come in. We see that happening. I've watched people getting ready to come across the border. They have this information they've used to transit Mexico, but they get there and they get rid of their identification and other records.
Would the gentleman yield?
Just 1 minute, please,
All right.
if I can make my point. So the final point I want to make with that is, we are effectively, and we want, if they need medication, we want to make sure they have the medication. But we're effectively putting that liability and onus on CBP with people we don't even know who they are, or if there's any connection whatsoever to that medication. And that's just one of many things in this bill, and I've talked about others, and so I'm going to yield to the gentlelady.
Just on that point, many years ago, we had a hearing, oversight hearing on the confiscation of medication. And one of the witnesses was a famous author. Her uncle was detained. He had a valid visa, but erroneously detained at Dulles Airport. They took his medication away, and he died. So we understand there could be contraband, which is why a medical professional is going to make a determination, but people can and in fact have died because medication has been removed from them that they needed to survive. So that's a real issue, and it's a serious one, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I would love to discuss it further, but my time is up.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 3239 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Those respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Nope. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Roll call. The recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
Final passage.
Ms. Jayapal? Yes, aye. Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stemmings? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean? Ms. McCarcel-Powell? Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stube? Mr. Liu votes yes. Ms. Dean votes yes.
Gentlelady from Texas? Has the gentlelady from Texas been recorded?
Ms. Jackson Lee is recorded as aye.
Okay. Are there any other members who wish to vote who haven't been recorded? The clerk will report. Oh, well, anybody? Who?
Mr. Raskin votes aye.
Has everyone voted who wishes to vote? The clerk will report. Catch your breath. I feel like saying catch your breath. Yeah, we're finished.
Mr. Chairman, there are 18 ayes and 13 noes.
The bill is reported. I have a page somewhere. Same thing. The bill is reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. The bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating all adopted amendments. And without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all our members for attending. The markup is adjourned.